Hey there and welcome back. If you have come to the end of a long day, if the lights are low and the noise of the world has finally died away, then settle in, because tonight we are going somewhere far from all of it. We are going to travel back more than 500 years, across the sea to a sunburnt kingdom of red earth and white walls, and then north again to a cold green island under grey skies, to follow one woman across the arc of her life. You know her name, or you think you do. She is usually remembered as the first wife, the one who was set aside, a sad footnote at the beginning of a much louder story about a king and his 6 marriages. But she was so much more than that, and tonight, slowly and without hurry, we are going to give her back to herself. Because before she was anyone's discarded wife, she was a daughter of the most powerful court in Europe, a princess raised to rule, and a woman who, when the most dangerous king in Christendom commanded her to disappear, looked him in the eye and refused. By the end of our few hours together, we will be sitting beside her in a cold and shabby manor house in the English fens on a January morning, as she dictates a last letter to the husband who has spent season trying to erase her, a letter that ends with words that have outlived everyone who tried to silence her. But that is the end, and we have a whole life to live before we reach it. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are, whether there is snow against the glass or warm air moving through an open window. If you find something steadying in these slow walks through the past, you might think about subscribing, so the next of these quiet evenings finds its way to you when you need it. I read the comments, all of them, and I am always moved by how a story this old can gather people from every corner of the world into the same hushed room at the end of the day. So tell me where your room is tonight, and then let your shoulders drop, and let the present loosen its grip, and let us go back. Picture this, a vast fortified palace on a high plain in the heart of Spain, in the closing years of the 15th century, its towers baking under a sun far fiercer than anything that island in the north could imagine. The air is dry, and smells of dust and rosemary and hot stone, and somewhere below in the courtyards there is the sound of horses and armoured men, and the endless coming and going of a court that never quite settles, because this court does not have a single home. The court moves constantly across the rough roads of a country still half at war with itself, dragging its tapestries and its treasure and its chapel and its archives from city to city in a groaning train of mules and wagons. At the centre of all this motion are 2 people who are remaking the world, a queen and a king who rule side by side as equals, and into their restless, brilliant, ferociously ambitious household, in the winter of 1485, a last daughter is born. They name her Catalina. We will come to know her as Catherine. To understand Catherine, you have to understand the woman who bore her, because Catherine was her mother's daughter in every way that mattered, and her mother was among the most extraordinary rulers Europe had ever produced. Isabella of Castile had taken a fractured, lawless, nearly bankrupt kingdom and bent it to her will through sheer force of intelligence and faith and nerve. She had married Ferdinand of Aragon, and together their 2 crowns formed the beginnings of what we now call Spain, though in their lifetimes it remained a patchwork of distinct realms held together by the partnership of these 2 people. Isabella was not a queen who sat in a tower and embroidered while men made the decisions. She rode at the head of her own armies. She reformed the law, the coinage, the church. She funded a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus on a voyage that, in the very year of Catherine's early childhood, would change the shape of the known world forever. And she did all of it while pregnant, again and again, carrying and bearing her children in the saddle and the campaign tent as often as in the palace, because the work of ruling never stopped, not for childbirth, not for anything. The defining project of Isabella and Ferdinand's reign, the consuming cause of the winter of Catherine's infancy, was the war against Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the Spanish peninsula. For centuries, the south of Spain had been ruled by Islamic dynasties, and the slow Christian reconquest had ground on for generation after generation until only Granada remained, a jewel of a kingdom in the mountains of the south, with its impossible rose-coloured palace, the Alhambra, rising above the city. Isabella was determined to take it, and take it she did. When Catherine was 6 years old, in January of 1492, the last Muslim ruler of Granada surrendered the keys of the city, and the banners of Castile and Aragon rose over the Alhambra, and the long reconquest was complete. Catherine, a small girl in her mother's travelling court, was there or near it for the culmination of one of the defining events of European history. She grew up, quite literally, inside a story of total and triumphant faith, a story in which her mother had been the instrument of God's will and had won. That conviction, that absolute certainty about the rightness of her cause and the support of heaven, sank into Catherine in childhood and never left her. It would one day make her utterly immovable, in a way that would astonish and infuriate the man who tried to break her. That same turning, 1492, was a year of terrible things as well as glorious ones, and it is part of Catherine's inheritance too. In the flush of victory, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the order expelling the Jews of Spain, tens of thousands of people driven from the only homeland they had ever known, a decision that we now see as one of the cruelties of the age, carried out in the name of the militant faith that had taken Granada. The Spain that made Catherine was a place of dazzling cultural achievement and ferocious religious certainty at the same moment, capable of beauty and learning and brutal intolerance all at once, and Catherine absorbed all of it, the faith and the iron and the conviction that there was one true church and that a monarch's highest duty was to defend it. She was, in this sense, completely her parents' creation. When she later faced the English Reformation and the dismantling of the church she had been taught to venerate, she faced it as a daughter of the sovereigns who had completed the reconquest and believed themselves the swords of God. She could no more have abandoned that faith than she could have stopped breathing. Catherine was the youngest of 5 surviving children, and like all of them, she was a piece on the wide chessboard of European diplomacy from the moment she drew breath. Royal children of this era were not raised to be happy. They were raised to be useful, to be married into other ruling houses, to forge the alliances that secured kingdoms, and the matches were arranged when they were tiny, sometimes when they were still in the cradle. Catherine's destiny was settled before she could walk. She would be sent to England to marry the heir to the throne of the Tudor king Henry VII, a man who had seized the English crown on a battlefield and desperately needed the legitimacy and the prestige that an alliance with the powerful sovereigns of Spain could bring. The boy she was to marry was named Arthur, Prince of Wales, and he was an infant when the match was made, just as she was. From the age of 3, Catherine knew that she was promised to a country she had never seen, to a boy she had never met, in a cold and rainy land at the far edge of the world. She was raised, in a sense, to be sent away, but she was raised superbly. Isabella was determined that her daughters would be the most accomplished princesses in Europe, and Catherine received an education that was, for a woman of her time, remarkable. She was taught by humanist scholars. She learned Latin until she could read it and speak it and write it with real fluency, a skill that would later let her converse with kings and ambassadors and theologians in the common tongue of educated Europe. She studied the classics, philosophy, religion, history, law. She learned the domestic arts as well, the spinning and weaving and fine needlework that even a queen was expected to master, and Catherine would sew her husband's shirts herself for the whole of their marriage. A small detail that tells you something true about her. She was devout to the bone, raised in the intense religious atmosphere of her mother's court, schooled by confessors and accustomed to long hours of prayer. And she was taught, above all, what it meant to be a queen by watching the greatest queen of the age do it every single day. She saw that a woman could rule, could lead, could hold absolute conviction and never bend. The lesson would cost her dearly, and it would also be the source of a courage that no one in England was prepared for. It is worth dwelling on the education Catherine received, because it was genuinely exceptional, and because it shaped the formidable mind that would one day argue her own case against the lawyers and theologians of England. Isabella of Castile had not herself received much formal learning as a girl, and she seems to have felt the lack of it keenly, because she was determined that her daughters would be educated as thoroughly as any prince. Catherine was placed under the instruction of the finest humanist scholars her mother could find, men steeped in the new learning that was spreading out of Italy across Europe, the recovery of the classical world and its languages and its wisdom. She learned Latin not as a dead language of rote grammar, but as a living tongue she could speak and read and write with real fluency. And this was no small thing, for Latin was the common language of educated Europe, the language of the church, of diplomacy, of law, of scholarship, and a princess who commanded it could converse on equal terms with cardinals and ambassadors and kings. She read the classical authors, the historians and poets and philosophers of Greece and Rome in their Latin forms, and she read the Church Fathers, the foremost theologians of the early Christian centuries, and she read Scripture. She was schooled in religion to a depth far beyond mere piety, so that she understood the arguments and the doctrines and could hold her own in matters of faith. She studied history and the law, the things a ruler needed to know, and alongside all this learning of the mind, she was taught the accomplishments expected of a noble lady, the music and the dancing, and the domestic arts of spinning and weaving, and the fine needlework at which she became genuinely skilled, for it was held that even a queen should know how to order a household and ply a needle. The result was a young woman of formidable intellectual equipment, devout and learned and capable, exactly the sort of educated princess that the new humanist age admired. The depth of that education would prove important in ways no one could have foreseen when it was given. Catherine took her own learning so seriously that, as Queen of England, she became a notable patron of scholarship and a champion of education for women. She supported the foremost humanist thinkers of her day. The Spanish scholar Juan Luis Vives, whom she patronized, wrote at her encouragement a treatise on the education of Christian women that became influential across Europe, arguing that women were as capable of learning as men and ought to be taught. Catherine oversaw her own daughter Mary's education with the same seriousness her mother had shown, ensuring that Mary received a rigorous humanist schooling, commissioning a course of study for her, raising her to be a learned and capable woman who could, if it came to it, rule. The erudite court of the early Tudor years, admired across Europe for its learning, owed much of its intellectual seriousness to its Spanish queen, and when the great crisis of her life came, that education was one of the things that made her so impossible to defeat. When Henry's lawyers and the theologians of the universities marshalled their learned arguments to prove that her marriage was invalid, they were not facing an ignorant or frightened woman who could be bewildered by Latin and canon law. They were facing a woman who could read their arguments in the original, who understood the scripture and the doctrine and the legal principles as well as they did, who had been trained from childhood to think and to argue and to know her own mind. She engaged with the case against her on its own terms, marshalling scripture and precedent and law in her own defence, consulting with the scholars who supported her, refusing to be baffled or browbeaten. The little girl whom Isabella had insisted should learn Latin became the queen who could not be out-argued, and that, as much as her courage and her faith, was part of why Henry found her such an immovable obstacle. He had married, without quite realizing it, one of the best educated women in Europe, and when he tried to reason her out of her marriage, he discovered that she could reason better than the men he sent against her. Let me take you into that Spanish world for a while, because Catherine carried it inside her all her life, and you cannot understand the woman who knelt at Blackfriars without first standing in the courts that made her. Picture the Alhambra in the time just after its fall, the rose-red palace of the vanquished kings of Granada, which Isabella and Ferdinand took for their own, and where the child Catherine would have walked as a small girl in the wake of her parents' triumph. It is among the most beautiful buildings ever raised by human hands, and it must have seemed to a child like something out of a dream. Courtyards open to the sky, with still pools of water that hold the blue and the passing clouds like mirrors. Fountains fed by channels running down from the mountains, so that everywhere there is the cool sound of moving water. Walls covered every inch in carved plaster worked into patterns of impossible intricacy, geometric stars and flowing script and interlacing vines, and above them ceilings like honeycombs of carved cedar, and tiles in deep blues and greens and golds running along the lower walls. The light comes through fretted screens in soft broken patterns, and the air smells of myrtle and orange blossom and water on hot stone. This was the prize her mother had won, the visible proof of God's favour and Castile's might, and the court that Catherine grew up in moved through such places as conquerors and inheritors, mixing the austere militant Catholicism of the Reconquest with the dazzling luxury of the Moorish civilization they had defeated. It was a world of profound contradictions, and Catherine absorbed all of them. She wore fine silks and slept in carved and gilded rooms, and she also knelt for long hours on cold chapel floors and learned that the flesh was to be disciplined and the soul prepared for God. She heard the language of Castile spoken with the hard pride of a people who believed themselves chosen, and she grew up watching the machinery of a powerful and ruthless state at work, the tax collectors and the soldiers and the inquisitors and the ambassadors, all serving the will of the two sovereigns at the centre. And always there was movement, because the court of Isabella and Ferdinand did not sit still. It travelled endlessly across the harsh and beautiful interior of Spain, from Toledo to Valladolid, to Granada to Seville, a vast slow caravan of mules and wagons and armed men winding along rough roads under an enormous sky, carrying the whole apparatus of government with it, the treasury and the chapel and the archives and the wardrobe. A royal child learned to live on the move, to be at home everywhere and nowhere, to sleep in a different palace or fortress or monastery every few weeks, to understand that home was not a place but a people, the family and the household that moved together through the kingdom. It was a restless, demanding, magnificent way to grow up, and it taught Catherine an adaptability and a toughness that would serve her well when she was sent to the far end of the world, because she had never been allowed to grow soft or settled in the first place. She had been raised, in a sense, already half in exile, always moving, always a stranger arriving somewhere new, and that early training in endurance and dignity on the road was part of what made her able to survive what was coming. What she could not have imagined in those warm and sunlit and certain years was how completely it would all be taken from her, and how cold the country was that waited at the end of her road. The Spain of her childhood was a place of total certainty, of victorious faith and unquestioned order, where her mother's word was law and God's favour was beyond doubt. She would spend the second half of her life in a country that tore up every certainty she had been raised on, that broke with the church she had been taught was eternal, that declared her marriage a sin, and her daughter a bastard, and her faith a kind of treason. And the iron that her Spanish childhood had put into her, the absolute conviction and the trained endurance and the unbending faith, would be both what let her survive it and what made surrender impossible. She was made in Spain, finished and sealed before she ever saw England, and England would never be able to unmake her, no matter how hard it tried. The years of waiting stretched on, as they always did with royal marriages, while the lawyers and ambassadors haggled over the dowry and the terms. But at last, in the late summer of 1501, when Catherine was 15 seasons old, the time came for her to leave. Imagine what that departure must have been. She would never see her mother again. She would never see Spain again. She was being sent to the far north, to a country whose language she did not speak, and whose climate she could barely imagine, to live and die among strangers. And everyone involved understood that this was almost certainly a final parting. There were no easy returns across that much sea and land in the 16th century. When Catherine knelt for her mother's blessing and turned toward the coast, she was turning away from everything she had ever known, forever, at 15. And she did it without flinching, because she had been raised to do exactly this, and because she believed it was God's will and her duty, and those two were, for Catherine, one and the same. The sea voyage was dreadful. The fleet that carried her north was battered by storms in the Bay of Biscay so violent that the ships had to turn back and shelter, and Catherine, who had never been to sea, was wretchedly sick and genuinely in danger. When they finally made the crossing, and she set foot on English soil at Plymouth in the autumn of 1501, the ordinary people of the West Country poured out to see her, this exotic Spanish princess with her strange clothes and her dark-haired retinue, and her ladies who rode in a manner the English had never seen. She was met with real warmth, and it is worth holding on to that, because the English people would love Catherine genuinely and durably in a way that mattered enormously later on. From the very first day they took to her, she was young and dignified and devout and brave, and something about her caught the affection of the common people of England and never let go, not through everything that came after. Let me take you onto that ship with her, because the crossing from Spain to England was an ordeal that tells you something about the girl who endured it. She set out in August of 1501, but the sea would not let her go easily. The fleet was driven back by storms in the Bay of Biscay, that notorious stretch of water where the Atlantic piles up against the coast, and Catherine, who had never been to sea in her life, was flung about in a wooden ship in weather violent enough to frighten experienced sailors. They had to give up and shelter on the Spanish coast and wait for the weather to turn, and then try again. And the second crossing was scarcely better. Imagine her, 15 years old, sick and frightened in a heaving cabin, the timbers groaning, the spray driving against the boards, every hour carrying her further from everything she had ever known toward a country she could not picture, to marry a boy she had never met. She prayed through it, certainly. She had been taught that God ordered all things and that her duty was to endure, and endure she did. When at last the ship made landfall at Plymouth in the autumn, The relief must have been enormous. The simple animal gratitude of solid ground under the feet after weeks of terror at sea. And what met her on that shore was something she could not have expected, a warmth that would matter to her for all her years to come. The ordinary people of the West Country, hearing that the Spanish princess had landed, poured down to the harbour to see her, and they took to her at once. There was something about this dark-haired, dignified, devout young woman, fresh from the sea, and clearly exhausted, and yet carrying herself with such grace, that caught the affection of the English common people from the very first day. One of her own party wrote that she could not have been received with greater joy had she been the saviour of the world. She went first to a church to give thanks for her safe deliverance, before she would do anything else, and that too the English noticed and approved, the piety of her, the seriousness. It was the beginning of a bond that would prove extraordinarily durable. The English people would love Catherine to the end of her days, through everything, and that love would become one of the few real powers she possessed in her winter of trouble. It is worth understanding why. She was foreign, and the English were suspicious of foreigners, and yet they took her to their hearts and never let her go. Part of it was her evident goodness, the genuine devotion and charity that everyone could see. Part of it was the romance of her story, the princess from the sunlit south come to the cold north. But part of it too was simply that she gave them her loyalty in return. Catherine became English. She learned the language. She made the country her own. She would spend more than 30 years in England, far longer than she had ever lived in Spain, and she came to love it and to think of herself as belonging to it, and the people sensed that and returned it. When the time came that her husband tried to cast her out, the people remembered the girl who had come ashore at Plymouth and gone straight to church to thank God, the Queen who had been theirs for 20 years, and they did not forget her, and they did not forgive him. She made her slow way east toward London through the autumn countryside, and the whole journey became a kind of triumphal progress, the towns turning out to greet her, the strangeness of her Spanish retinue and Spanish dress and Spanish customs a wonder to the English who lined the roads. She rode in a manner they had never seen, and her ladies with her, and the people stared and marvelled. And somewhere ahead of her, in London, the old king waited, anxious and calculating, and the boy she was to marry, and his robust younger brother, and the whole strange new world that was to be her life. She was 15. She had crossed the sea and survived it. She did not yet know that the gentle boy she had come so far to marry had only months to live, and that the real story of her life in England, that the long and terrible and magnificent story, had not even begun. Let me set the scene of the England Catherine arrived in, the kingdom and the court she was marrying into, because it was a younger, rawer, more anxious place than the courts of Spain, and that anxiety shaped everything that happened to her. The Tudor dynasty was brand new. Henry VII, the old king who rode out so eagerly to glimpse her, had won his crown only 16 turning before, on the battlefield of Bosworth, where he had defeated and killed the last king of the rival house, in the final battle of the long and bloody civil wars that the English would come to call the Wars of the Roses. For decades those wars had torn England apart, noble families slaughtering one another, kings made and unmade and murdered, the crown changing hands by violence again and again. Henry VII had ended all that, but his hold on the throne was not ancient and secure like the crowns of Spain. It was new, and he knew it, and the knowledge made him careful, suspicious, and above all desperate to secure his dynasty against any return to the chaos from which he had snatched it. This is the key to understanding why Catherine mattered so much and why, decades later, the lack of a son would seem so catastrophic. The whole Tudor project was about legitimacy and continuity, about proving that this new dynasty was solid and permanent, and not just one more faction that had grabbed the crown and would lose it to the next. Marrying his heir to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the most prestigious sovereigns in Europe, was a tremendous coup for Henry VII, a stamp of international legitimacy on his upstart house. And securing the succession, ensuring there was always a clear and unquestioned male heir to take the crown, was the obsession that drove everything, because the Tudors had seen, within living memory, what happened to a kingdom when the succession was disputed. The dread of those civil wars was the long shadow over the whole age, and it was that dread, as much as anything, that would later turn Henry VIII's lack of a son from a private sorrow into what he genuinely believed was a mortal threat to the realm. The court Catherine entered was magnificent in its way, but also newer and less polished than the dazzling courts of the continent. A kingdom on the rise but still finding its feet among the major powers. Henry VII had filled his treasury through careful, grasping management and had restored order and law, but he was a cold and watchful man, not a lover of display for its own sake, and his court reflected him. It was when his golden son came to the throne that the English court truly blossomed into one of the brilliant centres of Renaissance Europe, and Catherine was there at the heart of that flowering, the learned and dignified Spanish queen who helped give the young court its cultural seriousness. She brought with her the prestige and the manners and the learning of the greatest court in Christendom, and she helped to raise England in the eyes of Europe, to make it a serious player on the continental stage. And she understood, better than almost anyone, the dynastic anxiety that ran beneath it all, because she had been raised on exactly the same preoccupations in Spain, where her own parents had laboured to unite their crowns and secure their succession. She knew that her central duty, the reason she had been sent across the sea, was to give the dynasty its heir, to provide the son who would carry the Tudor line forward unquestioned into the future. She knew the weight of it, and she carried that weight willingly, and when year after time her body failed to produce the living son the dynasty demanded, she felt the failure not only as a private grief, but as a failure of the sacred duty she had been raised and sent and married to perform. The anxious, newly minted, insecure Tudor dynasty needed a son above all things, and Catherine could not reliably give it one, and in that gap, decades in the widening, lay the seed of everything that would eventually destroy her. Her first meeting with the Tudors had a strange, charged quality to it that the chroniclers remembered. The old king, Henry VII, anxious and impatient, could not wait for the formal protocols and rode out to meet her before the appointed time, brushing aside the Spanish insistence that the bride should remain veiled and secluded until the wedding. He wanted to see her, and with him rode his second son, a robust, golden 10-year-old boy bursting with confidence, who watched this Spanish princess arrive and could have had no idea, none at all, that he was looking at his own future wife. His name was Henry, Duke of York, but it was not Henry she had come to marry. It was his elder brother. Arthur, Prince of Wales, was 15, the same age as Catherine, and he was the cherished hope of the Tudor dynasty, named for the legendary King of Britain, raised from birth to wear the crown. He was by most accounts a gentle, studious, rather slight and delicate boy, very different from his boisterous younger brother. He and Catherine were married in lavish splendour at St. Paul's Cathedral in London in November of 1501, a wedding of enormous magnificence, designed to display the wealth and security of the new Tudor dynasty to the world. There were pageants and feasts and tournaments. The city was draped in finery. The two 15-year-olds, who could barely speak to each other since she had no English and he no Spanish, and they pronounced their shared Latin so differently they could hardly understand it, were the centre of a spectacle that announced England's arrival as a serious power allied to the greatest crown in Europe. And then they were put to bed together, with all the ceremony that royal weddings demanded, the bedchamber blessed, the couple watched to their sheets. The wedding is worth seeing in its full splendour because it was one of the grandest public spectacles of the age, and because it was the high tide of everything the alliance was meant to be, before any of the sorrow came. It took place at St. Paul's Cathedral in London in November of 1501, and the Tudors, a young dynasty still anxious to prove itself, spared no expense in making it magnificent. A raised walkway had been built the length of the cathedral, covered in fine cloth, so that the people crowded inside could see the bride and groom pass. Catherine was dressed in the Spanish style that so fascinated the English, in rich silks with a flowing veil, and on her head a coronet, and beneath her gown the hooped underskirt called a farthingale that the English had never seen before and would soon be copying. The young couple, both just 15, were married before the assembled nobility and clergy of England, and the boy who led Catherine to the altar, because her own escort was lacking, was Arthur's 10-season-old brother Henry, the Duke of York, playing his small ceremonial part with the confidence that would one day fill far larger rooms. Afterward came the feasting and the celebration, days of it, the kind of lavish display that announced to the watching ambassadors of Europe that England under the Tudors was wealthy, secure, and not to be underestimated. There were banquets of extraordinary elaboration, dishes carried in by the 100 subtleties of spun sugar, shaped into castles and beasts and allegories. There were tournaments in the tilt-yard, the chivalric sport of the age, the armoured knights thundering at one another with lances while the court watched from the stands, and the ladies looked on. There was dancing, and here a small bright detail survives that history loves, for at one of the celebrations the young Henry, the 10-year-old brother, danced so energetically that he grew hot and threw off his gown and capered about in his jacket, delighting the company, a flash of the boundless, boyish energy of the child who would one day be king. No one watching could have known what that little boy would become, or what he would one day do to the grave Spanish bride at the centre of the day's celebrations. And there was woven through all the magnificence, the constant thread of religion and ceremony that governed everything, the masses and the blessings and the solemn rituals that surrounded a royal marriage. For this was not merely a personal union, but a sacrament and a treaty and a dynastic act. All at once, the joining of two royal houses, sanctified by the church and witnessed by the realm. Every part of it carried meaning. The bedding of the young couple at the end, with all its public ceremony, the chamber blessed by the bishops, the pair watched to their bed, was itself a formal act. The completion of the marriage in the eyes of the world. What actually passed between the two frightened 15-year-olds once the curtains were drawn and the watchers withdrew, no one could truly know, and that unknowable private moment would, 3 decades later, become the most fought-over question in the kingdom. But on the night itself it was simply the expected conclusion of a grand public occasion, and the court went to its rest satisfied that the thing was done and the alliance sealed. For a few brief months it all seemed to have worked exactly as intended. The heir to the throne was married to the daughter of the greatest sovereigns in Europe. The dynasty was secured, the alliance forged, the future bright. The young couple were sent off to Ludlow on the Welsh border to keep their own princely court and learn the business of the rule that would one day be theirs. And then, in the cold spring of 1502, the whole carefully constructed edifice collapsed in a matter of days, when the sweating sickness or some other fever came to Ludlow and took the gentle, studious boy, who was to have been king, and left Catherine a widow at 16, far from home, her purpose gone, the magnificent wedding at St. Paul's already turned to ashes. Everything that came after, all the long decades of trouble, flowed from that sudden death in the border castle, and from the unanswerable question of what had or had not happened in the marriage bed of two children during the few short months it lasted. Let me take you to Ludlow, because it is where Catherine's first life ended, and the long uncertainty began, and the place has a melancholy that suits what happened there. Ludlow Castle stood on the wild western border of England, in the Welsh marches, a stone fortress on a hill above a river, far from London and the warmth of the court, a frontier stronghold from which the Prince of Wales was meant to govern the turbulent border country. It was the custom to send the heir there to learn the business of rule, and so within a few months of their magnificent wedding, the two 15-winter-olds, Arthur and Catherine, were dispatched to this remote and rugged place to begin their married life and their princely duties. It was winter when they went, and the marches in winter were cold and damp and bleak, a hard contrast to the golden celebrations of London. We know very little of those few months they spent together at Ludlow, the only true married life they would ever have, two children in a cold castle on the edge of the kingdom, unable even to speak easily to one another across the barrier of language. Whatever passed between them, it was brief, because in the spring of 1502 sickness came to the castle. It may have been the dreaded sweating sickness that swept England in those years, a terrifying disease that could kill a healthy person in hours, or it may have been some other fever bred in the damp. Both Arthur and Catherine fell gravely ill. For a time both their lives hung in the balance, the young prince and his Spanish bride lying sick in the cold border fortress, while their attendants feared for them both. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. In April of 1502, less than 6 months after the wedding at St. Paul's, the heir to the throne of England was dead at 15, and the whole bright future that had been built upon him collapsed in an instant. The grief in England was enormous, for Arthur had been the bright hope of the new dynasty, named for the legendary king, raised from birth to wear the crown, and now he was gone, and the succession suddenly rested on his boisterous 10-year-old brother. The old king and queen were said to have comforted each other in their grief with the reminder that they were still young enough to have more children, a cold dynastic consolation that tells you much about the world these people lived in, where even the death of a beloved son was reckoned partly as a problem of succession. And Catherine, barely 16, still weak from her own illness, found herself transformed in a matter of days from a princess with a brilliant future into a widow with none. She was a stranger in a foreign land, her husband dead, her purpose dissolved, her position suddenly precarious in the extreme. Everything she had been sent across the sea to be, the wife of the future king, the mother of kings to come, had evaporated. She was a king's daughter and a prince's widow, 16 turning old, alone in a cold country far from her mother and her home, and her whole future was now a question mark. The brief golden chapter that had opened with the storms of the Bay of Biscay and the cheering crowds at Plymouth and the magnificence of St. Paul's had closed, after only a few months, in sickness and death in a border castle. The long ordeal of her widowhood was about to begin, and it would last 7 bitter years, and it would teach her the endurance she would need for the far greater ordeal that waited unimaginably decades down the road. And here we arrive at the single most important question in Catherine of Aragon's entire life, a question that seems almost indecent to dwell on, and yet decided everything. The question of what did or did not happen between two frightened 15-year-olds in that bed. Because nearly 30 times later, the answer to that question, or rather the competing claims about it, would be used to try to destroy her. It comes down to whether Arthur and Catherine consummated their marriage. Catherine would swear for the rest of her life on her soul, on the sacrament, in the most solemn terms a believing Christian could muster, that they did not. She insisted, always and to the end, that she had come to her second husband as a virgin, that her marriage to Arthur had been a marriage in name only, never completed, 2 children who slept in the same bed, and nothing more. The other side, decades later, would produce witnesses claiming the boy had boasted the next morning, in the coarse way that boys do, that he had been, as he supposedly put it, in the midst of Spain that night. We will never know the truth. We cannot know it. But everything in Catherine's character, her absolute and unwavering insistence across decades on holy oath, with her immortal soul in the balance, has persuaded many that she was telling the truth, because Catherine of Aragon, whatever else she was not a liar, and she believed lying about such a thing would damn her eternally. Hold that question in your mind. It will return, and when it does, the fate of a queen and the religious future of a nation will hang upon it. Whatever did or did not happen in that bed, it did not matter for long, because within months the young couple was sent to Ludlow Castle on the wild Welsh border, to begin their life as Prince and Princess of Wales, and there, in the cold and damp of that remote frontier in the spring of 1502, disaster struck. An illness swept through the castle, perhaps the mysterious sweating sickness that terrified Tudor England, perhaps some other fever. Both Arthur and Catherine fell gravely ill. Catherine survived. Arthur did not. In April of 1502, less than 6 months after the magnificent wedding at St. Paul's, the heir to the English throne was dead at 15, and Catherine, barely 16, was a widow in a foreign country, lying sick in a border castle, her whole purpose and her whole future suddenly dissolved into nothing. What followed were the worst years of Catherine's life until the very end, and they lasted a long time. She was now a widow, a princess of Spain stranded in England, and she became overnight a diplomatic problem that neither her father nor her father-in-law much wanted to solve. The obvious answer was to marry her to the new heir, Arthur's younger brother Henry, and keep the precious Spanish alliance intact, and a betrothal to that effect was indeed arranged. But there were complications, enormous ones, that would echo down the decades. To marry your dead brother's wife was forbidden by canon law, by a passage in the book of Leviticus, unless the Pope granted a special dispensation. And whether such a dispensation was even valid depended on whether the first marriage had been consummated. The very question Catherine had sworn touched her not at all. A dispensation was duly obtained from Rome, covering every possibility, and the betrothal stood. But it stood on shaky ground, and worse, it became a hostage to politics. Catherine's mother, the formidable Isabella, died in 1504, and with her death Catherine's value on the marriage market collapsed, because the Spanish inheritance fractured, and her father Ferdinand was suddenly a far weaker and less useful ally. Henry VII, a cold and calculating man, began to wonder whether he could do better for his son elsewhere. And so Catherine was left to rot. For 7 long seasons she lived in England in a kind of suspended misery, neither wife nor truly free, a widow whose betrothal might or might not lead anywhere, caught between a father and a father-in-law who each tried to make the other pay her expenses, and neither of whom would. Her dowry was disputed. Her household went unpaid. She fell into real poverty, genuine debt, selling off her plate and jewels to feed her servants, writing desperate letters to her father begging for money that did not come, living in damp and neglected lodgings, her health suffering, her spirits ground down, year after year. She was a king's daughter and a prince's widow, reduced to something close to destitution, ignored and humiliated, her letters growing more and more anguished. It was a brutal education in the precariousness of a woman's position, even a royal woman's, but the men who controlled her fate found her inconvenient. And through all of it, through 7 winters of cold and debt and uncertainty, Catherine endured and prayed and did not break, and kept her dignity and waited. She was learning, though she did not know it, exactly the kind of patient, unbreakable endurance she would need most of all at the end of her life. The 7 years between Arthur's death and Henry's accession deserve a closer look, because they were a long ordeal of uncertainty and humiliation, and they tempered Catherine in ways that mattered enormously for everything that came after. Picture her situation in those years. She was a young widow in a foreign country, a princess of Spain whose entire purpose had been to marry the heir to England, and that heir was dead. She was now a piece of unfinished diplomatic business, valuable in theory because of the Spanish alliance, and the rich dowry still partly unpaid, but in practice an awkward problem that neither her father in Spain nor her father-in-law in England wished to pay for. And so she was left in a cruel limbo, betrothed to the new heir, young Henry, but not married to him, her future endlessly deferred while the 2 kings haggled over money and advantage. The material reality of those turning was genuinely wretched, and it is striking to think of a king's daughter reduced to it. Her household was not properly funded. Neither king would pay her expenses, each insisting it was the other's responsibility, and Catherine was caught in the middle, sliding into real debt and real poverty. She had to let servants go because she could not pay them. She sold off her plate and her jewels, the treasures she had brought from Spain, to keep her remaining household fed. She lived in poor and damp lodgings, her health suffering, her clothes growing shabby, writing letter after anguished letter to her father in Spain, begging for the money and the resolution that did not come. For a woman raised in the wealthiest court in Europe, the daughter of the sovereigns who had taken Granada, this descent into genteel destitution must have been a bitter education indeed, a lesson in exactly how precarious a woman's position could be, even a princess's, when the powerful men who controlled her fate found her inconvenient. And there were deeper humiliations than poverty. Her status was endlessly uncertain. At one point, Henry VII, exploring whether he could find a better match for his son, had the young Prince Henry formally repudiate the betrothal, so that for a time Catherine did not even know whether she was to be married or sent home in disgrace, a rejected bride of no use to anyone. She was a pawn, moved and left and threatened and ignored according to calculations entirely beyond her control, and there was nothing she could do but endure, and pray, and wait, and keep what dignity she could. For a proud and intelligent young woman who had been raised to a high destiny, the helplessness of it must have been almost unbearable. But Catherine did endure it, and that is the point, because those 7 years were a kind of long apprenticeship in exactly the qualities that would define her at the end of her life. She learned patience, the hard patience of a person whose fate is in other hands and who can do nothing but wait. She learned to keep her dignity when she had little else. She learned that her faith was the one possession that could not be taken, or sold or deferred, and she leaned on it. And she learned a deep and permanent lesson about the unreliability of the men and the politics that governed her, and about the necessity of an inner strength that did not depend on her circumstances. When the 7 years finally ended, and the young king raised her from her misery to the throne, she might have been forgiven for thinking the lesson was over, that the suffering was behind her, and only happiness lay ahead. In fact, the long apprenticeship in endurance was preparing her for a final ordeal far worse than the first, and the patience and dignity and faith she forged in those 7 lean time were exactly the weapons she would need. Decades later, when another king tried to reduce her to nothing all over again. And then, suddenly, everything changed. In April of 1509, Henry VII died, and the throne passed to his son, that golden, robust boy who had ridden out to glimpse Catherine 8 years before, now grown into a magnificent young man of 17, the new King Henry VIII. And almost the first thing younger folk king did, against the wishes of some of his advisers, was to announce that he would marry Catherine. Why he did it has been argued about ever since. Perhaps it was the dispensation and the diplomatic logic. Perhaps his dying father had urged it. But the evidence suggests something simpler and more romantic, which is that the young Henry actually wanted to. He seems to have admired her, this dignified, intelligent, devout older woman, 6 seasons his senior, who had borne her extended humiliation with such grace. He cast himself, in the chivalric language he loved, as her rescuer, the young knight who would lift the suffering princess out of her misery and raise her to the throne beside him. And so he did. They were married quietly in June of 1509, and then crowned together in a joint coronation of tremendous splendour at Westminster Abbey, Catherine riding through London with her long hair loose beneath a glittering coronet, the crowds cheering, the long nightmare of her widowhood swept away in a single glorious stroke. The moment when everything changed for Catherine, the spring of 1509, deserves to be felt in full, because it was as sudden and as complete a reversal of fortune as anyone could imagine, the turning of years of darkness into light in the space of weeks. For 7 years she had languished, a half-forgotten widow sliding into poverty and despair, her betrothal to the young prince uncertain, her future a blank. The old king, Henry VII, that cold and calculating man, had kept her in this limbo, neither releasing her nor fully embracing the match, using her as a bargaining piece while her youth drained away. And then, in April of 1509, the old king died, and his son, the boy who had grown into a magnificent young man of 17, came to the throne as Henry VIII. And almost the first thing he did was to decide that he would marry Catherine. Why he chose her, against some advice, and after all the winter of uncertainty, has been debated ever since. The dispensation was in place. The Spanish alliance had its uses. His dying father may have urged it, or may have urged the opposite. But the likeliest truth is the simplest and the most human, which is that the young king actually wanted to. He seems to have genuinely admired this dignified, intelligent, devout older woman who had borne her long humiliation with such grace, and he cast himself, in the romantic and chivalric language he loved, as her rescuer, the young knight who would lift the suffering princess out of her misery and raise her to glory beside him. It was a role that flattered his sense of himself, the gallant deliverer, and Catherine, after 7 barren years of waiting, was only too willing to be delivered. There was real feeling in it, on both sides, at least at the start. For Catherine, the reversal must have felt like a miracle, like the direct intervention of the God she had never stopped trusting through all the years of trial. One season she was a neglected and impoverished widow, her prospects gone, her youth fading, her position humiliating. The next she was Queen of England, married to a young and ardent king who appeared to adore her, raised in a single stroke from the depths to the very summit. Everything she had endured, the poverty and the uncertainty and the long patient waiting, was suddenly vindicated, redeemed, swept away. She was 23, and the whole of a golden future seemed to open before her. A young king at her side, a brilliant court at her command, and surely, soon, the children who would secure it all. It is one of the cruelest patterns in her life, this rhythm of soaring hope followed by devastating loss, and it played out twice, in a terrible symmetry. The first time, the magnificent wedding to Arthur had been followed within months by his death and her descent into the wilderness of widowhood. Now the glorious rescue and the joint coronation opened a marriage that would, after turning of apparent happiness, decay into the slow nightmare of the great matter, and end with her cast aside and shut away to die. Twice she was raised to the heights, and twice the heights gave way beneath her. But she could not see the second fall coming, any more than she could have foreseen the first. And on the day of her rescue in 1509 there was only joy and gratitude, and the conviction that her long trial was over, and her faith had been rewarded. She had no way of knowing that the young king who saved her would, in the fullness of time, become the old king who destroyed her, and that the rescue of 1509 was only the beginning of a far longer and far crueler story. For Catherine, after 7 years in the wilderness, it must have felt like resurrection, like the vindication of all her faith and patience. She was just 23. She was Queen of England at last, married to a young king who appeared to adore her, restored from poverty and neglect to the very summit of the world. And for a time, a good long time, the marriage was genuinely happy. This is something the later story tends to bury, but it is true, and it matters. Henry and Catherine, in the early years, were a real partnership, and by the standards of royal marriages, something close to a love match. He jousted in her honour, wearing her initials, calling himself Sir Loyal Heart. He sought her counsel and valued her judgment. She was older, steadier, more politically experienced than he was, raised at the most sophisticated court in Europe, and she gave him wise advice, and he listened. When he went off to make war in France in 1513, chasing the military glory he craved, he left Catherine behind as regent of England, ruling the kingdom in his absence, and she did not merely keep the seat warm. The joint coronation of Henry and Catherine in June of 1509 deserves to be seen in its glory, because it was the dazzling beginning of what everyone believed would be a long and golden reign, and because for Catherine, after 7 times of poverty and neglect, it was the day her whole life seemed to turn from darkness back into light. The young king, newly come to his throne and his power, was determined that his crowning, and the crowning of his bride beside him, should be a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence, a declaration to the whole kingdom and the watching world that a new and brilliant age had begun. London was made ready. The route from the Tower to Westminster was hung with rich cloth, tapestry and arras and cloth of gold draped from the windows and the fronts of the houses, the streets railed and gravelled and cleared. On the day before the coronation itself, by tradition, The royal pair processed through the city from the Tower to Westminster so that the people could see them, and Catherine rode in that procession dressed in white, in shimmering satin, her long hair, the hair of a bride and of a queen about to be crowned, falling loose down her back beneath a coronet set with precious stones, carried in a litter of cloth of gold. The crowds came out in their thousands to see her, this Spanish princess they had taken to their hearts 8 years before, now raised at last to the throne, and they cheered her through the streets. After the long humiliation of her widowhood, the poverty and the neglect and the uncertainty, she rode through the cheering city as Queen of England, restored and vindicated and triumphant, and it must have felt to her like nothing less than resurrection. The coronation itself took place at Westminster Abbey, the ancient church where English monarchs had been crowned for centuries in a ceremony of solemn splendour. Henry and Catherine were anointed with the holy oil and crowned together, king and queen side by side, before the assembled nobility and clergy of the realm, with all the sacred ritual and the music and the magnificence that the occasion demanded. And then came the days of celebration that followed, the coronation feast in Westminster Hall, the tournaments and the pageants, the young king eager to display his prowess and his magnificence, the whole court caught up in the joy and promise of a new reign, and a young and apparently devoted royal couple at its head. For Catherine it was the summit of her life, though she could not know it then. She was 23 years old. She had endured the death of her first husband, 7 seasons of poverty and uncertainty and humiliation, the death of her formidable mother, the collapse of her prospects, and she had come through all of it to this, crowned Queen of England beside a young king who appeared to love her, her sufferings swept away, her future bright. Everything she had been raised for seemed to have come to pass. She was a queen, as her mother had been a queen, married to a king who valued her, mistress of a brilliant court, with the whole of a golden reign apparently stretching out ahead of her. She had no way of knowing that this day of triumph was the high point from which her remaining years would, by slow and terrible degrees, descend, that the young king crowning her would one day be the old king destroying her, that the loose bright hair of the bride would one day be the grey hair of a captive in a damp manor in the fens. On the day itself there was only joy and promise, and Catherine, crowned and triumphant, had every reason to believe that the hardest part of her life was behind her. I want to dwell on Catherine's devotional life, because her faith was not a single trait among many, but the organising centre of her whole being. And to understand her, you have to understand how completely religion shaped the texture of her days. From her childhood in Spain, she had been formed in an intense and disciplined piety, and she carried its rhythms with her to the very end. She rose in the small hours of the night to pray, kneeling on the cold floor while the household slept, keeping the ancient monastic hours of devotion. She heard Mass daily, often more than once. She kept the fasts of the church with a rigour that sometimes alarmed those around her, depriving her body to discipline her soul. And beneath her rich royal robes, against her skin, she wore the rough wool habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, the penitential garment of a laywoman who had bound herself to a religious rule, a secret mortification that no one saw, but that she kept faithfully through all her winter, as queen. This was not a gentle, comfortable faith. It was the austere and demanding religion of the Spain that had taken Granada, a faith of discipline and sacrifice and absolute submission to the will of God, and Catherine practiced it with total seriousness. She gave generously to the poor, far more than display required, and took a genuine interest in charity and in the relief of the suffering. She went on pilgrimage, travelling to the holy shrines of England, above all to the famous shrine of Our Lady at Walsingham in Norfolk, the holiest place of pilgrimage in the kingdom, where she went again and again across the years to pray, especially in her desperate longing for a living son. Picture her there, the Queen of England, having put off her shoes as pilgrims did for the last stretch of the road, walking the final miles to the shrine in humility, kneeling before the image of the Virgin to beg for the child that heaven kept withholding. Her religion gave her, above all, a framework within which to understand and bear her sufferings, and this is what made it the source of her unbreakable strength. She believed with complete conviction that nothing happened outside the will of God, that her trials were sent or permitted by heaven for purposes she might not understand, and that her duty was to bear them with patience and faith. When her children died, she grieved, but she also submitted, believing them taken by God. When her marriage was attacked, she did not bend, because she believed God had joined her to Henry, and that no earthly power could undo a sacrament. And when she was stripped of everything and shut away in cold houses to die, she found in her faith a place to stand that no king could reach, a certainty that she was right with God and that her suffering, borne faithfully, was itself a kind of service, and even a kind of triumph. It is impossible to separate Catherine's courage from her faith, because her faith was the root of her courage. The reason she could face down the most powerful king in Europe, alone and unarmed, was that she feared God far more than she feared Henry, and she believed that to surrender her marriage would be to damn her soul, which was a fate infinitely worse than any worldly suffering Henry could inflict. Her religion made her, in the most literal sense, fearless, because it had taught her that the only thing truly to be feared was sin and the loss of God, and against that all the threats and pressures of the king weighed nothing at all. Henry could take her crown, her home, her daughter, her health, her life. He could not take her soul, and her soul was the only thing she would not risk, and so on the one ground that mattered most to her she was simply unconquerable. The iron faith of her Spanish childhood, demanding and austere and absolute, was the secret of the immovable courage that astonished everyone who witnessed it, and it never failed her, not once, through all the years, down to the last prayer on her lips in the cold morning at Kimbleton. For a while Henry was in France. The Scots invaded the north, and it was Catherine, the Queen Regent, heavily pregnant, who rallied the kingdom's defence, who sent the armies north, who rode out herself toward the front to address the troops, invoking, one imagines, every lesson she had learned watching her warrior mother. And the English army met the Scots at a place called Flodden, and destroyed them utterly, killing the King of Scots himself, and the flower of the Scottish nobility, in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought between the two nations. It was Catherine's victory as much as anyone's, won under her regency, and she sent Henry, in France, a piece of the dead Scottish king's bloodied coat as a trophy, with a letter of fierce triumph. This was no shrinking, passive wife. This was Isabella's daughter, a queen who could hold a kingdom and win a war. In these turning Henry had in Catherine exactly the partner a young king could have wished for, and had he never needed anything from her but counsel and companionship and a queen's dignity, they might have grown old together in contentment. But he needed one more thing from her, the prize that kings craved above all else, and it was the one gift that, try as she might, with all her faith and all her will, she could not reliably give him. He needed a son. Let me take you to the autumn of 1513, to the one time in Catherine's life when she held the whole power of the kingdom in her own hands and showed exactly what Isabella's daughter was made of, because it is too often forgotten and it deserves to be seen. Henry had sailed to France in the summer, chasing the military glory he craved, leaving his queen behind as regent of England, the ruler of the kingdom in his absence, with full authority over the government and the defence of the realm. It was an enormous trust, and it was about to be tested in the hardest possible way, because the King of Scots, allied to France and seeing England's army away across the sea, seized the moment to invade across the northern border with a vast host, the most dangerous Scottish invasion in a generation. And it was Catherine, the Queen Regent, who rose to meet it, and she did not merely sit in London and wait for news. She threw herself into the organisation of the kingdom's defence with an energy and competence that astonished the men around her. She oversaw the raising and arming and dispatching of troops to the north. She saw to the supply, the artillery, the logistics of war. And then, heavily pregnant though she was, she rode north herself toward the front, intending to be near her army, and she addressed the troops with the fierce spirit of a queen who had grown up watching her mother ride at the head of armies against the Moors. The blood of Isabella, the warrior queen of Castile, ran in her, and in that crisis it showed. She was every inch a sovereign in her own right, holding a kingdom and rallying it to war. The English army met the Scots at a place called Flodden in the northern hills on a September day, and there they won one of the most complete and bloody victories in the long history of the wars between the two nations. The Scottish army was shattered. The King of Scots himself was killed, along with a wide swathe of the Scottish nobility, the flower of the kingdom cut down in a single catastrophic afternoon, leaving Scotland leaderless and broken. It was a triumph won under Catherine's regency, on her watch, organised under her authority, and she felt the pride of it keenly. She sent word of the victory to Henry in France, and with it, in a gesture of fierce and almost savage triumph that tells you she was no gentle creature, a piece of the dead Scottish king's bloodied coat, suggesting it might serve as a banner, regretting only that English custom would not let her send the king's body itself. It is worth holding on to this image of Catherine because it is so utterly at odds with the meek and passive victim of the popular memory. This was a woman who could govern a kingdom, organise a war, and exult in a victory won under her command, a queen in the full sense her mother had taught her, capable and forceful and entirely equal to the highest responsibilities of rule. Had her life run differently, had she given Henry his son and grown old beside him, she might be remembered as one of the finest queens consort of English history, the Spanish princess, who held the realm and won at Flodden while her husband was away. The fact that she ended as a discarded captive in a cheerless house should never erase the fact that she was at her height a ruler of real power and real ability, and that the courage she showed at the very end, alone and unarmed against the king, was the same courage that had organised an army and rallied a kingdom in 1513. It was in her all along. The trials of her later life did not create her strength. They only revealed, in a different and harder form, the strength that had been there from the beginning. There is a side of Catherine's queenship that the later tragedy tends to bury entirely, and it is her role on the wide stage of European affairs, because for many years she was not merely Henry's consort, but a genuine diplomatic force, the living link between England and the mighty Habsburg power that dominated the continent. She was the daughter of the sovereigns of Spain, the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the man who ruled Spain and the Netherlands and much of Italy and the new empire across the ocean, the most powerful monarch in the world. That made Catherine, sitting in England, a person of real international weight, and she used it. She worked, consistently and skillfully, to keep England and the Empire allied, to bind her husband's kingdom to her nephew's vast dominions, and for years English foreign policy leaned in the direction Catherine favoured, towards Spain and the Empire, and against France. Let me give you a sense of Catherine as a person, what she actually looked like and how she struck those who knew her, because it is easy to lose the living woman behind the grand events, and the contemporary glimpses of her are worth gathering. As a young woman when she first came to England and in her early time as queen, she was considered genuinely pretty, even beautiful. She had the fair, reddish colouring that was admired in the age, not the dark Spanish looks one might expect, but a clear complexion, blue or grey eyes, and long hair of a reddish gold that she wore loose at her coronation in the manner of a bride and a queen. She was small in stature, somewhat short and growing rounder as the years and the pregnancies took their toll, but in her youth she was fresh and attractive, and the young Henry, 6 years her junior, was clearly taken with her. The pregnancies and the griefs and the season aged her as they would age anyone, and by the time of the great matter she was a stout, matronly woman in her 40s. Her beauty faded, her figure thickened, her face grown heavy, while her husband, by the cruel arithmetic of their age difference and his vigorous health, was still in something like his prime. This physical contrast was part of the tragedy, the aging wife and the still vigorous husband, whose eye had begun to wander toward younger women, and Catherine knew it and felt it, though she bore it with her usual dignity. But beauty had never been the heart of what she was. What people remarked on, again and again, was not her looks but her character, her bearing, the quality of her presence. She was, by all accounts, dignified to the depths, possessed of a natural majesty and gravity that impressed everyone who met her, a queenliness that was not put on, but was simply who she was, the daughter of mighty sovereigns raised to a high destiny. She was gentle and gracious in her ordinary dealings, genuinely kind to those around her, charitable to the poor, beloved by her servants and her household. She was intelligent and learned, able to hold her own with scholars and diplomats. She was devout to the point of austerity, and serious, not given to frivolity, though not without warmth. And beneath all the gentleness and the grace there was the iron, the absolute will, and the unbreakable conviction that emerged fully only when she was tested, the steel that let her face down a king. People who knew her only in her gentle aspect were astonished during the great matter to discover how immovable she could be, how much granite lay beneath the grace. It is this combination that makes her so compelling, the gentleness and the steel together. The gracious and charitable queen who was also the most stubborn opponent Henry ever faced. She was not a warrior or a schemer or a woman of dramatic passions. She was something rarer and in its way more formidable, a person of complete integrity, whose gentleness was real and whose strength was real, and in whom the two were not opposites, but expressions of the same deep wholeness of character. She was exactly what she appeared to be, all the way down, with no gap between the public face and the private truth, and that integrity was the source both of the love she inspired and of the immovable resistance that defeated every effort to break her. People trusted her because she was trustworthy. People loved her because she was lovable. And the king could not break her because there was nothing false in her to exploit, no crack in the wholeness, only the solid and unyielding truth of a woman who was, through and through, exactly who she said she was. The great set piece of European diplomacy in these years was the famous meeting between Henry and the King of France near Calais in 1520, the gathering so lavish that it has been remembered ever since as the field of cloth of gold, for the fabric of the tents and pavilions in which the two young kings and their courts tried to outshine each other in a riot of display, with temporary palaces and golden fountains running with wine and weeks of feasting and jousting. Catherine was there, at the heart of it, the Queen of England playing her part in the grandest diplomatic theatre of the age. But her sympathies, everyone understood, lay elsewhere with her nephew the Emperor, the chief rival of the French king, and indeed Henry met privately with Charles both before and after the French extravaganza, in meetings that mattered far more than the golden show, and in steering her husband toward the imperial alliance, Catherine was doing real and consequential political work. This was the role she had been raised for, and she filled it with the skill of a woman bred at the most sophisticated court in Europe and trained from childhood in the arts of statecraft. She received ambassadors and corresponded with foreign courts and advised her husband on the weighty questions of war and alliance, and she did it well, a true partner in the business of rule, and not merely an ornament at its ceremonies. For years, she was one of the leading figures in European affairs, the Spanish Queen of England, the keystone of the alliance between two of the continent's major powers. It is part of the cruelty of what came later that this accomplished and influential stateswoman was reduced, in the end, to a powerless captive, her counsel scorned, her very title denied, the wide reach of her European importance counting for nothing against her husband's determination to be rid of her. And yet that European importance never entirely vanished, and it was, in a strange way, both her shield and the thing that doomed her. Because her nephew was the emperor, Henry could not simply do away with her quietly, as a lesser woman might have been done away with. The emperor's watchfulness, the threat of his displeasure, the impossibility of the Pope ruling against the aunt of the man who held him captive, all of this protected Catherine from the worst, kept her alive and gave her cause its standing in the courts of Europe. But it also made her impossible for Henry to discard cleanly, turned what might have been a simple annulment into a six-winter international crisis, and ensured that the great matter became entangled with the whole religious and political future of Europe. Catherine's blood, the very thing that made her so grand and so valuable, also made her a problem too large to solve by ordinary means, and in the end Henry could only be rid of her by tearing England out of the Church of Rome altogether. She was brought low by the same exalted family connections that had made her one of the weightiest figures on the continent, and the daughter of Spain, who had helped steer the affairs of Europe, ended her days as the prisoner her own grandeur had helped to make her. Let me show you something of what those early years as queen were actually like, the good turning, because they were real and they lasted longer than the later story tends to allow, and Catherine is worth seeing in her happiness as well as her sorrow. Picture the court of the young Henry VIII in the years around 1510 and after, among the most brilliant and pleasure-loving courts in Europe, presided over by a golden young king in the fullness of his strength, and a Spanish queen admired across the continent for her learning and her grace. It was a court of constant entertainment, of music and dancing and disguising, of hunting and hawking and the chivalric games of the tilt-yard. Henry was magnificent in these years, tall and athletic and accomplished, a fine musician who composed and sang, a scholar who could argue theology in Latin, a sportsman who exhausted everyone around him. And at the centre of it, as his honoured partner, was Catherine, 6 times older, steadier, wiser, a daughter of kings, who gave the young court its dignity, as Henry gave it its energy. Their daily life in these years had the rhythm of a brilliant Renaissance household at the height of its confidence. There were the religious observances that framed every day the masses and the offices, for both of them were genuinely devout. Henry in his showy way, and Catherine in her deep and private one. There was the business of rule, the councils and the audiences, and the endless stream of petitioners and ambassadors, and Catherine was no ornament in this, but a real political presence, consulted and influential, especially in the affairs of Spain and the wide web of European diplomacy, in which her father and then her nephew were central players. There were the long hours of leisure that a wealthy court filled with pleasure, the cards and the dice and the music, and the lavish set-piece entertainments, the pageants and masques that Henry adored, in which the king and his companions would burst into the queen's chambers in disguise and lead the ladies out to dance. And there was the famous moment when Henry, jousting, took the queen's initials as his device and rode as her champion, Sir Loyal Heart, proclaiming his devotion before the whole court. And there was the private side, the real marriage underneath the public partnership, and by every sign it was, for a good while, a genuinely affectionate one. Catherine did Henry's shirts with her own hands, the fine linen shirts he wore against his skin, sewing and embroidering them herself as a wife of her upbringing was taught to do, a small intimate labour of love that she continued, astonishingly, even into the bitter years of the great matter, when she still insisted on making his shirts as his true wife, until Anne Boleyn found out and was furious. They wrote to each other warmly when they were apart. He trusted her judgment and leaned on her steadiness. When he sailed to France in 1513 to chase his dreams of military glory, it was Catherine he left as regent, the ruler of England in his absence, the highest mark of trust a king could give, and she repaid it by holding the kingdom and winning a war. For those few seasons, Henry and Catherine were as close to a true partnership as any royal couple of the age, the young king and his Spanish queen, and had God only granted them the living son they both so desperately wanted, the whole history of England would have run another way, and Catherine would be remembered, if at all, as the beloved and dignified consort of a mighty king, and not as the first casualty of his terrible second act. But underneath the brilliance, the shadow was already gathering, year by year, in the form of the children who came and did not live. Every pregnancy was a hope and a public event, and every loss was a private grief and a deepening dynastic dread, and across the good winter the losses mounted, the stillbirths and the miscarriages, and the infant son who lived his 52 days and died, until the joy of the early court was increasingly haunted by the question that no entertainment could quite drown out, the question of who would inherit, the question of the son who would not come. Catherine prayed and fasted and wore her hidden penitential habit and bore her losses with the fortitude of her upbringing, and Henry stayed young and turned his eyes elsewhere, and the warm partnership of the early years cooled by slow degrees into something more distant, until the day came when the king looked at his aging, sunless, devout, immovable wife, and began to wonder whether God had ever meant them to be married at all. The story of Catherine's pregnancies is one of the saddest in the whole history of English royalty, and it has to be told gently, because behind the cold dynastic arithmetic of heirs and succession lies a woman losing baby after baby across the best turning of her life. She conceived again and again. The first child, a daughter, was stillborn early in 1510. The second, born on New Year's Day of 1511, was a living son, a prince, and the kingdom erupted in joy. He was christened Henry, Duke of Cornwall, and there were celebrations and tournaments and bonfires, the dynasty's future seemingly secured. He lived 52 days. He died at the end of February, and the grief of it nearly broke them both. There were more pregnancies after that, and more losses, miscarriages and stillbirths and infants who lived only hours, a long procession of tiny coffins and dashed hopes stretching across the years. Each loss was a private agony and a public anxiety, because every pregnancy was watched by the whole kingdom, and every failure deepened the unspoken fear that there would be no son to inherit, and that England, which had so recently torn itself apart in civil war over a disputed succession, might descend into chaos again. And we should pause and feel the weight of this on Catherine herself, not just on the dynasty. She was a deeply maternal, deeply loving woman who wanted children with all her heart, and she carried them and bore them and buried them over and over, and prayed through every pregnancy with desperate intensity, and watched her own body, as the time passed, become less and less able to give her husband and her kingdom the one prize they needed. She fasted and prayed and made pilgrimages. She wore, beneath her royal robes, the rough habit of a Franciscan penitent, mortifying her flesh in private devotion. She believed, as her age believed, that the fate of children was in God's hands, and she could not understand why God, whom she served so faithfully, withheld the son she begged for. The strain of it, the repeated grief, aged her. She had been a fresh and pretty young woman at her coronation, fair-haired and round-faced and admired. The endless cycle of pregnancy and loss wore her down, thickened her figure, lined her face, while across the years her husband stayed young and vigorous, and began, inevitably, to look elsewhere. I want to stay a little longer with the children, because the bare facts of Catherine's pregnancies passed too quickly over what was for her the central and most heartbreaking labour of her life. Across roughly a decade she was pregnant at least 6 times, perhaps more, and out of all those pregnancies only one child survived to grow up. Try to feel the human reality behind that sentence. It means that this loving and maternal woman spent the better part of 10 years either carrying a child or recovering from the loss of one, that she knew again and again the hope and the quickening and the long waiting, and then again and again the blood and the grief and the tiny still form, or the brief flicker of a life that guttered out in days. It means a decade structured around hope and loss, with the whole weight of a kingdom's expectation pressing on each pregnancy, and the whole weight of a kingdom's disappointment falling on each failure. The losses were not private griefs that she could mourn quietly. Each royal pregnancy was a public event, watched and prayed over by the whole realm, because the succession, the very stability of the kingdom, depended on its outcome. So each loss was a public failure as well as a private agony, announced and mourned and anxiously calculated, each one deepening the unspoken dread that there would be no son, and that England might slide back into the chaos of disputed succession that the Tudors had so recently ended. The boy born on New Season's Day of 1511, the prince who lived his 52 days, was the cruelest of all, because he was real, a living son, christened and celebrated, the future apparently secured, the bonfires lit and the tournaments held, and then he died at the end of February, and all that public joy curdled into public grief, and Catherine and Henry mourned him with a private anguish that the chroniclers noted. And Catherine took the losses, as she took everything, into the realm of her faith, which made them at once more bearable and more agonizing. She believed that children were given and taken by God, and so each loss was, in some sense, God's will to be accepted with submission. But she could not understand why God, whom she served with such total devotion, withheld from her the son she begged for with such desperate prayer. She fasted and prayed and went on pilgrimage to the famous shrine of Our Lady at Walsingham and elsewhere, beseeching heaven for a living son. She wore her hidden penitential habit and mortified her flesh. She searched her conscience for the sin that might have brought such punishment, and found none, and prayed on. The repeated grief and the repeated self-examination wore at her body and soul, aging her before her time, thickening the figure that had been girlish at her coronation, lining the round and pretty face, draining the youth out of her while her husband stayed vigorous and golden at her side. There is a terrible irony folded into all of this, which only history could reveal. Henry became convinced, eventually, that the deaths of his children were a divine judgment, the curse of Leviticus for marrying his brother's widow, and he used that conviction to justify casting Catherine aside. But Catherine's run of obstetric tragedy was not unusual for the age, not a mark of divine displeasure, but simply the ordinary brutal arithmetic of childbearing in a time of high infant mortality, the same arithmetic that would, in a grim echo, claim most of the children of Henry's later wives too. And the one child who did survive all those pregnancies, the daughter Mary, whom Henry counted as not enough, would in fact grow up to rule England as queen, the living heir Catherine had given him after all, just not in the shape he demanded. The son Catherine prayed for never came, but the daughter she bore and raised and loved became exactly what Henry tore the kingdom apart to obtain, a Tudor sovereign of her own blood upon the throne, and he never lived to see it, and never understood that the wife he discarded had given him his heir all along. In 1516, at last, a child lived. Catherine gave birth to a daughter who survived, a healthy, clever little girl they named Mary, and the relief and joy were real. Henry, putting a brave face on the fact that it was not the son he wanted, declared that they were both still young and that sons would surely follow, that if it was a girl this time, by the grace of God, the boys would come. Catherine adored her daughter. Mary became the centre of her world, the one child out of all those pregnancies who lived and thrived, a bright, musical, precocious girl, on whom Catherine lavished all the fierce love of a mother who had lost so many. She oversaw Mary's education personally, bringing in the finest scholars, ensuring her daughter received the same superb humanist learning she had received from Isabella, raising Mary to be, should the need arise, a queen who could rule, just as Catherine's own mother had ruled. For a while, the family of three seemed settled, even happy. But Mary was a daughter, and no daughter had ever successfully ruled England in her own right, and the memory of the long dynastic wars made the prospect of a female heir feel to Henry and his anxious advisers like a recipe for catastrophe. The pressure for a son did not ease. It grew, and as the years passed and Catherine grew older and no son came and none now seemed likely to come, the marriage that had begun in such warmth began, slowly and then not so slowly, to cool. Henry, still in the vigour of his early manhood, took mistresses, as kings did, and Catherine, raised in the Spanish tradition that a queen endured such things in dignified silence, endured them. One of those mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, bore Henry a healthy son in 1519, a boy he acknowledged and openly doted on, and eventually made Duke of Richmond, and the existence of that thriving illegitimate boy was a quiet dagger in Catherine's side, living proof to Henry that the failure to produce a male heir was not his failure but hers. The distance between the king and queen widened. He was restless, hungry for glory and pleasure and the future, and she was aging, pious, grieving, increasingly retreating into her religion. They still kept up the forms. She was still the queen, still treated with honour, still his partner in the grand ceremonies of state. But the heart had begun to go out of it, and into the widening gap. In the early 1520s, there walked a young woman newly returned from the French court, dark-eyed and quick and dangerous. one of Catherine's own ladies-in-waiting, whose name was Anne Boleyn. We do not need to dwell long on Anne Boleyn here, because this is Catherine's story and not hers, but we have to understand what Anne's arrival set in motion, because it became the engine that destroyed Catherine's life. Henry fell for Anne with the helpless, obsessive intensity of a man who had never been denied anything, and Anne, cleverly, refused to become merely another mistress. She would have the king in marriage or not at all, and that refusal turned Henry's wandering desire into a fixed and consuming purpose, because to marry Anne he would have to be free of Catherine, and so the king set about convincing himself and the world that he had never truly been married to Catherine in the first place. He found his weapon, as men of his age did, in Scripture, in that same passage of Leviticus that warned against marrying a brother's wife, declaring that such a union would be cursed and childless. Henry seized on it. He persuaded himself, with the terrible sincerity of a man who needed to believe it, that his lack of a living son was the curse of Leviticus, divine punishment for marrying his brother Arthur's widow, that he had been living all these years in sin, and that his conscience now compelled him to set the unlawful marriage aside. It was, he insisted, a matter not of desire, but of conscience. Almost no one believed him. Everyone could see Anne standing behind the conscience. But Henry believed it, or made himself believe it. And a king who believes God commands what he already wants is the most dangerous force on earth. We should look at Anne Boleyn's rise for a moment through Catherine's own eyes, because it has too often been told only from Anne's side or Henry's, and what it meant to Catherine. To watch it happen from inside her own household is its own particular kind of anguish. Anne was not some stranger who appeared from nowhere. She was one of Catherine's own ladies-in-waiting, a young woman who served in the Queen's household, who attended Catherine daily, who was there among the women around her, and it was from within that intimate circle that Henry's eye fell upon her, and his obsession grew. Imagine the slow horror of it for Catherine, to realise that the woman her husband was falling in love with was one of her own attendants, present in her own rooms, a familiar face among the ladies who dressed her and walked with her and served her, now the object of the king's consuming desire, and before long the instrument of the Queen's destruction. For a lengthy time Catherine maintained, in public, the dignified composure that her whole upbringing demanded. A queen did not rage at her husband's infidelities. She endured them in silence, as Catherine had endured the earlier mistresses, as her own training and the customs of Spain required. And so for a long while Catherine kept up the forms, treated Anne with the correct coldness of a queen toward a lady who had displeased her, and refused to give Henry or anyone the satisfaction of seeing her broken or undone. There is a famous scene, much later, in which Anne and Catherine are said to have played cards together, the Queen and the woman who was supplanting her, and Catherine, with a flash of the steel beneath the dignity, remarked pointedly on Anne's luck, a small cold moment of two women locked in a struggle to the death, observing the outward courtesies of the court. Catherine's composure in the face of Anne's rise was not weakness or passivity. It was discipline, the iron self-command of a woman who would not let her enemies see her suffer. But beneath the composure the situation was agonizing and increasingly dangerous. As Henry's purpose hardened from desire into the fixed determination to marry Anne, Catherine found herself fighting not merely against a rival, but against the whole power of the crown bent on her removal. Anne was not content to be a mistress. She wanted the throne, and to get it she needed Catherine gone. And so Anne became not just the occasion of Catherine's troubles, but increasingly an active force in them, pressing Henry forward, growing impatient at the delays, resentful of the Queen who would not step aside. The famous incident of the shirts captures it. The moment when Anne discovered that Catherine was still making Henry's shirts with her own hands, as a wife does for a husband, and was furious at this quiet assertion of Catherine's enduring status as the true wife. Two women, the discarded queen and the rising favourite, locked in a long and bitter contest, with a kingdom and a faith, and the future hanging on the outcome. And there is a terrible symmetry in how it all turned out, which Catherine did not live quite long enough to see completed, but which she would surely have understood. Anne won the throne after a winter of struggle, only to find it a far more precarious perch than she had imagined. The same king whose obsessive desire had torn the kingdom apart, to have her cool toward her with frightening speed once she was his, just as he had cooled toward Catherine, and when Anne too failed to give him the living son he craved, and when she made the enemies that a queen cannot afford, the machinery turned against her as it had turned against Catherine, only faster and far more brutally. Catherine died in January of 1536, still insisting she was the true queen. Anne Boleyn was dead on the scaffold less than 5 months later, destroyed by the same man in the same ruthless pursuit of an heir. The woman who had supplanted Catherine outlived her by barely a season, and in that grim sequence there is the whole truth about Henry VIII laid bare, a man who consumed the women who loved or served or married him one after another, in the endless hungry pursuit of the sun, and the certainty that always escaped him. The whole edifice of Henry's argument, however, rested on a single foundation, and that foundation was the claim that Catherine had been truly married to Arthur, truly his wife in the full physical sense, so that her later marriage to Henry fell under the curse of Leviticus. And this is where Catherine's lifelong insistence became the immovable rock on which the king's case broke, because Catherine said, calmly and absolutely, and without the slightest wavering, that she had never been Arthur's wife in anything but name. She had come to Henry a virgin, untouched, and therefore there had been no impediment, no sin, no curse, and her marriage to Henry was good and holy and valid in the eyes of God and the Church, and nothing on earth would make her say otherwise. She was not merely defending her position. She believed it with the whole force of her devout and honest soul, and she believed that to lie about it, to agree that her true marriage was no marriage, would be to commit a mortal sin, to bastardize her beloved daughter Mary, and betray God. She would die first. And so, when Henry expected her to do the convenient and graceful thing, to accept a quiet annulment and retire to a convent with her dignity intact, as many royal wives had done before her, he ran headlong into something he had not remotely anticipated. He ran into Isabella's daughter, and she would not move. We should try to understand Henry himself at this point, because the man who set out to destroy Catherine was not the gross and obvious tyrant of legend, not yet, and the truth of him is more unsettling than any cartoon villain. The Henry of these years was still, in many eyes, an admirable king, intelligent and accomplished and devout, and that is precisely what makes what he did so disturbing. The danger in him was not simple cruelty. It was a nearly limitless capacity to believe that whatever he desired was also what was right and what God willed, and to reshape the truth in his own mind until it agreed with his desire. When Henry wanted something badly enough, his conscience did not oppose the want. It rearranged itself around the want, and then presented the result to him as the voice of God. This is the most dangerous quality a powerful man can possess, and Henry possessed it to an extraordinary degree. You can see it most clearly in the matter of his conscience over the marriage. When Henry declared that his union with Catherine troubled his conscience, that he feared he had been living in sin all these years, that the deaths of his sons were heaven's judgment on an unlawful marriage, he was not simply lying to clear a path to Anne Boleyn, though that is what almost everyone around him assumed. The more unsettling likelihood is that he had genuinely come to believe it. He had wanted Anne, and he had wanted a son, and out of those wants his mind had constructed a sincere and unshakable theological conviction that his marriage was cursed and void. The desire came first, and the conviction grew up around it like a shell, hardening until Henry himself could no longer tell, and did not wish to tell, which was the appetite underneath, and which was the righteousness on top. A man who can do that to his own conscience is capable of anything, because he will commit any cruelty while feeling himself to be the instrument of justice and the wronged and faithful servant of God. This is what Catherine was truly up against, and it is why her situation was so much more dangerous than it might first appear. She was not merely resisting a husband who had tired of her and wanted a younger woman. She was resisting a husband who had convinced himself that God demanded her removal, that to set her aside was a holy duty, that his own desire was the voice of heaven. Against an ordinary faithless husband, reason or appeal or compromise might have had some purchase. Against a man armoured in divinely sanctioned self-justification, nothing had any purchase at all, because every argument she made, every appeal to the truth, simply confirmed him in his sense that she was the obstacle to God's will, the stubborn woman standing between him and his righteous purpose. The very qualities that should have moved him, her faithfulness and her honesty, and her 2 decades of devoted service, became in his transformed conscience merely the persistence of an error that had to be overcome. And there was a further turn of the screw, which is that Catherine's own immovable certainty mirrored Henry's, so that the two of them were locked in a collision of absolute convictions that could never be resolved. Henry was certain that God wanted the marriage ended. Catherine was equally certain that God had joined them, and that no power on earth could put them asunder. Both believed they were doing the will of heaven. Both were utterly sincere. Both were completely immovable. But Henry held all the power, that the throne and the law and the growing machinery of a state he was bending entirely to his will, and Catherine held nothing but her conviction and the loyalty of the common people and the distant support of her nephew the emperor. It was the most unequal contest imaginable, and Catherine lost everything in it, her title and her home and her daughter, and finally her life. And yet, in the only terms that mattered to her, the terms of truth and faith and the salvation of her soul, she did not lose at all, because the one thing Henry needed from her, her own agreement that she was not his wife, was the one thing he could never extract. He could destroy her. He could not make her lie. And so even in her total worldly defeat, there was a victory that all his power could not touch. This was the beginning of what contemporaries learned to call, in lowered voices, the king's great matter, and it would consume 6 turning and tear England apart. Henry first tried to have the matter settled quietly and quickly at home. He turned to his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England after the king himself, and charged him with obtaining the annulment. Wolsey, who had delivered everything else Henry had ever wanted, was confident he could deliver this too. He was wrong, and his failure would destroy him, because the matter could not be settled in England. It had to go to Rome, to the Pope, who alone could rule on the validity of a marriage that a previous pope had sanctioned with a dispensation. And the Pope in these years was in an impossible position, because the most powerful monarch in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose armies had recently sacked Rome itself and held the Pope very nearly prisoner, happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the son of her sister. Charles was not going to permit the public humiliation of his aunt, the declaration that she was no true wife and her daughter no true heir. And so the Pope, trapped between the King of England demanding an annulment and the Emperor forbidding it, did the only thing he could do. He delayed, he temporized, he sent legates and convened commissions and found endless reasons to postpone, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. While the time dragged on, and Catherine waited, and Henry seethed, and Anne grew impatient, and England held its breath. For a time the best hope was a public trial, a legatine court convened on English soil under papal authority, which would hear the case and rule. It met in the summer of 1529 at the Dominican monastery of Blackfriars in London, and it produced the single most extraordinary scene in Catherine's entire life, the moment that, more than any other, has fixed her forever in the imagination of history as a woman of unbreakable courage. So let us go there now, into that crowded hall, and stand among the witnesses, and watch a queen refuse to be erased. Picture the crowded hall at Blackfriars on the 21st of June 1529. It is crowded and tense and hung with cloth, the air, thick with the heat of an English summer, and the presence of the most powerful men in the kingdom. At one end, upon raised chairs beneath canopies of state, sit the two papal legates who are to judge the case, Cardinal Wolsey and the Italian Cardinal Campeggio, sent slowly and reluctantly from Rome. The king sits upon his own throne to one side, beneath the cloth of estate. The queen sits apart, in her own chair. The bishops arranged in their robes, the lawyers with their papers, the assembled nobles and the courtiers, and as many spectators as could be crammed into the space, all of them gathered to watch the King of England put his marriage of 20 years on trial. The court is called to order. The case is opened. And it is at this moment, when the lawyers expect to begin their slow work, that Catherine does the thing no one has prepared for. She rises from her chair, and instead of addressing the legates, instead of speaking to the court that has been assembled to judge her, she crosses the floor of the hall in front of everyone, the whole length of the long room, and she comes to where Henry sits upon his throne, and she kneels down at his feet. The hall goes utterly silent. Imagine it. The Queen of England, on her knees before her husband in front of the entire court, and then she begins to speak, not in the cold formal language of the law, but as a wife to the husband of 2 decades, in words that have come down to us across nearly 500 years, and have lost none of their power to move. She speaks in accented English, the language of the country she has made her own. She calls him her lord. She begs him, for all the love that has been between them, and for the love of God, to let her have justice and right, to take pity on her, for she is a poor woman and a stranger, born outside his realm, with no sure friend here, and no impartial counsel. And then she says the thing that goes to the very heart of it, the thing that cannot be answered. She reminds him, before the whole court, that she has been his true and humble wife for 20 seasons, that she has always conformed herself to his will and his pleasure, that she has loved all those he loved, whether she had reason to or not, that she has been a true wife to him in everything, and that she has borne him children, though it has pleased God to call them from this world, and she calls upon his own conscience directly, in front of every witness in that hall, to say whether she had not come to him a true maid, without touch of man. She puts it to him as a question he must answer before God. If there is any just cause that he can allege against her, she says, any reason of dishonour or unfitness, she is content to depart to her shame and rebuke. But if there is none, then she humbly begs him to let her remain in her rightful place. and she reminds him finally that the case touches the judgment of God and that she will not submit herself to this court, which she does not believe to be impartial, but appeals over their heads to the Pope in Rome and to God himself. And then, having said it, she rises. She makes a deep and graceful reverence to the king, her husband, the man trying to destroy her, and she turns and she walks out of the hall. She does not return to her seat. She simply leaves, walking the length of the long room and out through the doors, leaning on the arm of one of her attendants. The court is stunned. The crier is sent after her, calling her name, summoning her formally to return, for a defendant cannot simply walk out of her own trial. She hears it. She does not turn around. She has submitted herself to no court of England, only to God and the Pope, and she keeps walking, out of the hall, out of the proceeding, out of the trap that has been so carefully laid for her, and there is nothing the assembled power of the realm can do to bring her back. It is one of the boldest acts of defiance in English history, performed not with an army or a weapon, but with absolute moral conviction and unshakable dignity, by a woman entirely alone, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something they would never forget. Catherine did not stand entirely alone in the long struggle, and one man above all deserves to be remembered for the courage with which he stood beside her, because he paid for it with his life. He was John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, an old man by the time of the great matter, learned and austere and utterly fearless, among the most respected churchmen in England, and a scholar of European reputation. From the beginning, when others trimmed and calculated and bent to the king's will, Fisher stood up for Catherine, and for the validity of her marriage, with a boldness that astonished and infuriated Henry. He became her fierce champion, the one prince of the church in England who would not be cowed, and his defence of her was as brave as anything in the whole story. His most famous moment came at the Blackfriars trial itself, when, in the midst of that carefully managed proceeding, Fisher rose and declared, to the king's face and before the whole court, that he was prepared to defend the validity of the marriage with his life, that he would die for it as St. John the Baptist had died for the sanctity of marriage. It was a breathtaking thing to say, a direct and public defiance of the king on the most dangerous possible ground, and it electrified the court. Henry never forgave it. Fisher had named the king, by implication, as a man trying to put away a lawful wife, had cast himself as the Baptist and Henry, unmistakably as the tyrant who had killed him, and the comparison hung in the air with all its terrible implications. From that moment Fisher was a marked man, the bishop who had dared to stake his life on Catherine's cause. In the end he kept his word, though the manner of his death was not quite what he had foreseen. When the break with Rome came, and Henry required his subjects to swear the oath acknowledging his supremacy over the church, Fisher would not swear, because to do so would have been to deny the authority of the Pope and the truth of Catherine's marriage and everything he believed. He was imprisoned in the Tower, an old and frail man, and held there in hard conditions, and still he would not yield. The Pope, perhaps unwisely, named him a cardinal while he was in prison, which only enraged Henry further, who is said to have declared that Fisher might wear his cardinal's hat on his shoulders, for he would have no head to put it on. And so the old bishop was condemned and led out to execution in the summer of 1535, going to his death with the same serene courage that had marked his whole defence of the truth, one of the first martyrs of the English Reformation, dead for the cause of the marriage he had sworn to defend with his life. His death, and the death of Thomas More just days later, sent a shock through Europe, for these were men of international stature, famous for their learning and their holiness, and their execution for refusing to abandon the old faith and the lawful marriage revealed to the whole continent how far Henry was now prepared to go. For Catherine, in her exile, the news of Fisher's death must have been a grief and a horror, the killing of the brave old man who had stood up for her when almost no one else would, who had staked and now lost his life on the truth of her marriage. She had not asked anyone to die for her. She had asked only to be left in the place God had given her. But the consequences of her refusal to yield rippled outward into the deaths of the best men of the age, and she carried that knowledge with her into her own last months. The weight of knowing that her cause, just as it was, had cost the lives of others braver and better treated than herself, who had chosen to stand with her and had paid the ultimate price for it. The trial, robbed of its central figure, limped on and then collapsed. Cardinal Campeggio, under secret instructions from Rome to delay and never to deliver a verdict, adjourned the court for the summer recess, according to the Roman calendar, and the case was recalled to Rome to be heard, if it was ever heard at all, hundreds of miles away under the eye of Catherine's nephew, the Emperor. Henry had failed. The great public trial designed to free him had produced nothing but the image, now burned into the memory of the whole kingdom, of his wronged and dignified wife kneeling before him and then walking out with her head high, and the cost of that failure fell first upon the man who had been charged with delivering the impossible. Cardinal Wolsey, who had risen higher than any commoner in England, was finished. Stripped of his offices, his palaces seized, sent away in disgrace and then arrested for treason, he fell ill on the journey south to face the king's justice, and died at Leicester Abbey in the late autumn of 1530, a broken man who is said to have lamented at the end that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have abandoned him in his grey hairs. Catherine had not brought Wolsey down, but that his fall was a direct consequence of her refusal to yield, and it removed the last commanding figure who had tried to manage the crisis by the old rules. What came after Wolsey would not play by the old rules at all. The collapse of the Blackfriars trial deserves a closer look, because the way it failed reveals the trap that Catherine was caught in and the strange, agonizing slowness of the whole ordeal. The court at Blackfriars had been convened under the authority of two papal legates, Cardinal Wolsey and the Italian Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, who had been sent from Rome to hear the case. But Campeggio had come carrying secret instructions, and those instructions were not to deliver a verdict at all. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and the overwhelming power of Catherine's nephew, the Emperor, who held Rome very nearly in his grip, wanted above all to avoid deciding the case one way or the other, because any decision would enrage one of the two most dangerous men in Europe. And so Campeggio had been sent not to judge, but to delay, to spin the proceedings out, to find every possible reason for postponement, in the hope that the problem would somehow dissolve before he was forced to rule. He was very good at it. He raised procedural objections. He called for documents. He questioned the validity of the dispensation that had permitted Catherine's marriage to Henry in the first place, sending men to Spain to examine the records. He delayed and delayed, and when the summer came he invoked the practice of the Roman courts, which suspended their business for the hot months and adjourned the whole proceeding for the summer recess, with no verdict given and no prospect of one. And shortly after that adjournment, the case was formally recalled to Rome, removed from England altogether to be heard, if it was ever heard at all, hundreds of miles away under the very eye of the Emperor, which meant in practice that Henry would never get the ruling he wanted, because the Pope would never dare to give it. The English king had been comprehensively outmanoeuvred, and he knew it. and his fury at the humiliation was boundless. For Catherine, the recall of the case to Rome was, in one sense, exactly what she had wanted, for she had always insisted that the matter could only be judged by the Pope, and had appealed over the heads of the English court to Rome. But it was also, in a deeper sense, the beginning of the end, because it meant that the legal process would grind on for years without resolution, suspended in a permanent limbo, while Henry, denied the ruling he craved, was driven step by step toward the radical conclusion that he would simply seize the authority to rule on his own marriage himself, by breaking with Rome altogether. The very thing that protected Catherine in the short term, the Pope's refusal to rule against her, drove Henry in the long term toward the revolution that would destroy her far more completely than any annulment could have done. Had the Pope simply ruled, one way or the other, the matter might have ended cleanly. Instead it festered for season, and in the festering it grew into something monstrous, the wholesale tearing of England out of the Roman Church. And through all those years of legal limbo, Catherine waited, in an agony of suspended uncertainty that was its own form of torture. She held to her position with absolute consistency, insisting she was Henry's true wife, refusing every pressure to accept an annulment or retire to a convent, appealing always to Rome and to God. But she had to maintain that immovable stand month after month, winter after year, while the case crawled through the Roman courts and never resolved, while Henry's patience curdled into rage, and his rage hardened into the determination to break the church, while Anne Boleyn grew more powerful and more impatient at her side, and while Catherine's own position was eroded step by step, her household reduced, her access to her daughter threatened, her title coming under attack. The slowness was deliberate, and it was merciless, the wearing down of a woman across years in the hope that exhaustion or despair would accomplish what argument could not. It never did. But the turning of waiting were their own long punishment, and Catherine endured them with a patience that, by the end, had hardened into something like granite. What came after Wolsey was a new and colder kind of mind, a man named Thomas Cromwell, who saw what Wolsey had not been able to deliver and offered Henry a solution of breathtaking audacity. If the Pope would not annul the marriage, then England would simply stop recognizing the Pope. If Rome's authority stood in the way, then Rome's authority over England would be abolished altogether. The king would be declared supreme head of the Church in England, answerable to no one, and an English court under an English archbishop would grant what Rome had refused. It was nothing less than a revolution, the tearing of England out of the universal church that had shaped it for 1,000 years, and it would be done, in the end, so that Henry could discard one wife and take another. The machinery of separation began to turn. A pliant cleric named Thomas Cranmer was raised to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Parliament passed act after act severing the bonds with Rome, and in the spring of 1533, with Anne Boleyn already secretly married to Henry and visibly pregnant, Cranmer convened his own court and pronounced, with the swiftness Rome had never managed, that the marriage of Henry and Catherine had never been valid, and that the king was free. For Catherine, the news was a kind of spiritual catastrophe, but it changed nothing in her own conviction. A court she did not recognize, headed by an archbishop she considered no true authority, acting under a king who had usurped the place of the Pope, had declared that she had never been a wife. She rejected it utterly. She was Henry's true wife, married in the sight of God with the full sanction of the Church, and no act of an English Parliament and no ruling of a schismatic court could change a sacrament. She would go to her grave insisting on it, but insistence could not protect her from what followed, because Henry now held all the power, and he used it to begin the long, petty, grinding campaign of humiliation designed to force her to submit. First, they took her title. She was no longer to be called Queen. She was to be styled Princess Dowager, the widow of Prince Arthur, the title that fit the fiction that she had been Arthur's true wife and never Henry's. Catherine refused to answer to it. She crossed out the words on documents. She instructed her servants to address her as Queen and dismissed those who would not. When officials came to demand that she accept the new title, she sent them away. She had nothing left but her conviction and her dignity, and she defended them with the ferocity of a woman defending her soul. It is worth standing back for a moment to take in the sheer scale of what was happening to England in these years, the religious earthquake that Catherine's marriage crisis set off, because she stood at the very centre of one of the decisive turning points in the history of the Western world. For 1,000 times England had been part of the universal Church of Rome, woven into the fabric of Catholic Christendom, its faith and its calendar and its monasteries and its deepest assumptions about life and death, all shaped by the old religion. And then, in the space of a few years, to free one king from one marriage, all of it was torn up. The king was declared supreme head of the church in England. The authority of the Pope, which had stood unquestioned for 1,000 seasons, was abolished by Act of Parliament, and the monasteries, those ancient and seemingly eternal institutions that held so much of the land and the learning and the charity of the kingdom, were dissolved one by one, their communities scattered, their treasures seized, their proud buildings stripped, and left to fall into the romantic ruins that still stand across the English countryside today. This was not a quiet administrative adjustment. It was a revolution that reached into every parish and every life, and it cracked the country down the middle. There were those who welcomed it, the reformers who believed the old church corrupt and longed for a faith stripped back to Scripture. And there were those who were horrified, who saw in it sacrilege and rebellion against God and the destruction of everything holy, and some of them rose in open revolt, as the Northern Rising called the Pilgrimage of Grace would show, and some of them went to terrible deaths rather than accept it. To Catherine, raised in the militant Catholic certainty of the Spain that had taken Granada, the whole thing was an abomination, a king setting himself in the place of the Pope, a nation tearing itself away from the one true church, and all of it done so that her husband could discard her and call his sin a marriage. She could not accept it, could never have accepted it, because to do so would have meant denying the faith that was the very substance of her soul. And here is the thing that binds Catherine inescapably to this vast upheaval. It was her marriage, and her refusal to surrender it, that forced the crisis to its revolutionary conclusion. Had Catherine done the convenient thing? Had she accepted an annulment and retired quietly to a convent, as so many royal wives had done before her, Henry would have had his freedom by the ordinary means, and the dramatic break with Rome might never have been necessary. It was precisely because Catherine would not yield, because she fought the annulment with every weapon she had, and appealed over Henry's head to the Pope, and because the Pope, constrained by her nephew the Emperor, would not grant what Henry demanded, that Henry was driven at last to the radical solution of abolishing the Pope's authority altogether. Catherine's immovable resistance, her refusal to lie about her marriage, was one of the forces that drove England out of the Roman Church. She did not intend it. She would have been appalled to think she had helped cause the very schism she abhorred. But by standing immovable on the truth of her marriage, she made the ordinary solution impossible and forced the extraordinary one, and so the most devout Catholic in England became, against everything she willed, one of the unwitting midwives of the English Reformation. There is a deep and painful irony in that, and Catherine, with her sharp and educated mind, may even have grasped some of it in her years of exile. The faith she defended was the very faith being destroyed, and her defence of it helped to destroy it faster. Her loyalty to Rome helped to drive England out of Rome. The woman who would rather have died than abandon the old church found that her steadfastness had helped to bring about the new one. It is one of history's cruelest patterns, the way that the actions of the faithful and the brave can produce the very outcomes they most dread, and Catherine lived it to the full. And yet there is no reproach in it, for she did the only thing a person of conviction could do, which was to hold to the truth as she saw it, and let the consequences fall where they would. She could not have prevented the Reformation by surrendering, not really, for the forces driving it ran far deeper than her single marriage, but she could have surrendered her own soul by lying, and that she would not do, and so she stood, and the world broke around her, and she went down still standing. And so began the years of banishment, the slow exile that would last until her death. Henry moved her away from court, away from the centre of power, to a succession of increasingly remote and uncomfortable houses, each one chosen, it seemed, to be a little colder and damper and more isolated than the last. Her household was reduced, her servants stripped away, her income cut. She was watched, her letters intercepted, her movements restricted, kept in a kind of genteel imprisonment in the cold and unhealthy houses of the eastern counties. And worst of all, by far the worst of all, they took her daughter from her. Mary, now a teenager, was separated from her mother and forbidden to see her. The two of them kept apart deliberately, as a means of pressure on them both, to break Catherine's will by breaking her heart. Catherine and Mary, who loved each other with a fierce devotion, were never allowed to meet again. They wrote to each other when they could, smuggling letters past the guards. Catherine sending her daughter words of faith and courage, urging her to obey the king in all matters that did not touch her conscience or her soul, but in those that did to stand firm, as her mother stood firm. It was a cruelty calculated and sustained across winter, the separation of a dying mother from her only child, and Henry maintained it to the end. Through all of this, Catherine never wavered, and her endurance in these years is one of the most remarkable aspects of her whole story. She had every worldly reason to give in. She could have ended her own suffering, and her daughters at almost any moment, simply by signing what they put in front of her, by accepting the annulment and the title of Princess Dowager, and retiring to a comfortable convent, and she would have been treated with honour to the end of her days. But she would not, because to her it was not a matter of comfort or even of her own life. It was a matter of truth and of God. To accept the annulment would be to lie, to deny the sacrament of her marriage, to declare her daughter a bastard, and to abandon the faith her mother had raised her in. She believed that her soul and Mary's legitimacy and the truth itself were at stake, and against those things her own physical comfort and even her life weighed nothing at all. So she stayed in her cold houses and answered to no title but queen, and refused every demand year after season with a stubbornness that drove Henry to fury and won her the awe even of her enemies. The emperor's ambassador, a sharp-eyed Spaniard named Eustace Chapules, who became her devoted defender and our chief source for these turning, marvelled at her courage. She had become, in her isolation and powerlessness, the most formidable opponent Henry had ever faced, precisely because she had nothing left to lose and feared nothing but God. I want to slow down on the texture of those banishment years, because it is easy to say the word exile and pass over it. And what Henry actually did to Catherine was a long, deliberate, grinding cruelty carried out over years, and it is worth understanding what it meant day by day. She was moved from house to house, each one chosen, it seemed, to be meaner and damper and more remote than the last, through the flat and watery country of the eastern counties, where the air was bad and the winters were hard. These were not the warm palaces of her time as queen. They were cold manor houses, some of them half ruinous, in unhealthy fenland where the damp crept into the bones and fevers came off the marshes, and a woman whose health was already failing was kept in them on purpose, with her household cut down and her comfort stripped away, in the hope that misery and isolation would do what argument had not, and break her will, her world contracted year by season. The vast household of a queen, the hundreds of servants and officers, was reduced to a small and dwindling band of loyal attendants, mostly the Spanish servants who had come with her long ago and refused to abandon her now. Her income was cut, so that she struggled to maintain even her reduced household and to pay the faithful few who stayed. She was watched constantly, her rooms and her movements controlled, her letters intercepted and read, visitors turned away or admitted only under supervision, so that she lived in a kind of genteel imprisonment, a queen kept like a dangerous prisoner, because that, in a sense, is what she had become, the most dangerous opponent the king possessed. And around her the agents of the king came and went, the officials sent to bully her into accepting the title of Princess Dowager, to make her sign, to wear her down, and she met them all with the same unyielding refusal, sending them away, crossing out the false title on every document, withdrawing to the few rooms she kept as her own, where she could not be compelled. Find, hold through Fiffet, and Potts Brunflon se Canter, and Typer Shimmerse. The letters between Catherine and her daughter, smuggled past the guards in those years of forced separation, are among the most precious and heartbreaking things she left behind, and they deserve to be lingered over, because in them we hear the private voice of the mother beneath the public courage of the queen. Mother and daughter had been forbidden to see each other, kept deliberately apart to wear them both down, and so the only contact left to them was the written word carried in secret by trusted servants who risked much to deliver it. Across that perilous and intermittent thread, Catherine poured out to Mary everything she could not say in person, the love and the counsel and the faith of a mother who knew she might never hold her child again. What she wrote to Mary was not soft comfort, but something harder and truer, the counsel of a woman preparing her daughter to survive in a dangerous world while keeping her soul intact. She urged Mary to obey the king her father in all matters that did not touch conscience or the law of God, to be dutiful and patient and humble, to give her enemies no needless cause against her. But where conscience was touched, in the matters of faith and of the truth of her parents' marriage, Catherine urged her daughter to stand firm whatever the cost, to trust in God, to keep faith, to be, in the deepest sense, her mother's daughter. She told Mary to keep her heart and her virtue whole, to trust that God would not send her more than she could bear, to obey in all that was lawful, but never to surrender what belonged to God alone. It was the distilled wisdom of Catherine's own life, the very strategy by which she herself survived, passed to her daughter across the gap that her enemies had opened between them. Tatardek. There is an almost unbearable poignancy in the situation. A mother and a teenage daughter who loved each other fiercely, separated by the cruelty of a king, able to reach each other only in stolen words on smuggled paper, each of them in danger, neither able to protect or comfort the other except through these fragile letters. Catherine knew she was dying through much of this. She knew the letters might be the last of herself she could give her child. And so she gave Mary what she had, which was her faith and her love and her counsel and her example, the inheritance of the Spirit, since every other inheritance had been stripped from them both. The letters were Catherine's way of mothering her daughter across an impossible distance, of continuing to shape and strengthen and love the child she was forbidden to see, of being a mother to the very end, despite everything Henry did to prevent it. And they worked in their way, for Mary did draw strength from her mother's example, held out for years against the pressure to deny her own legitimacy, and carried her mother's faith and her mother's iron with her ever after, for good and for ill. The bond between them, which Henry had tried so hard to sever, proved in the end unbreakable, sustained across the winter of separation by these smuggled words, and it outlasted Catherine's death. When Mary at last came to the throne, she would honour her mother's memory and her mother's faith with a devotion that shaped her whole reign. The letters had done their work. The mother had reached the daughter across every barrier, and the love and the faith had passed from one to the other, exactly as Catherine intended, so that even in death, even forbidden to see her child's face, Catherine of Aragon had succeeded in the one task that mattered most to her, which was to remain, to the very end and beyond it, Mary's mother. She made of those few rooms a kind of fortress of the spirit, and her weapon in it was her faith. She rose in the dark to pray as she had been taught in her mother's court half a century before and a world away. She knelt for hours on the cold floor. She wore beneath her gown the rough wool habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, the penitential dress of one who has given herself to God. She fasted, often beyond what was wise for a sick woman. She ordered the shrinking days of her household around the offices of the church, the masses and the prayers, clinging to the rhythms of the faith that no king could take from her. And she wrote letters, smuggled out past her watchers, to her nephew the emperor and to his ambassador Chapuis, and above all, and most painfully, to her daughter Mary, from whom she was now entirely cut off. Those letters to Mary are among the most moving things she left behind, a mother forbidden to see her child, pouring out across the page everything she could not say in person, urging her daughter to be virtuous and obedient in all things lawful, but to hold fast in matters of conscience and faith whatever it cost, to be, in short, her mother's daughter, unbreakable to the end. What is most remarkable about these years is that the cruelty did not work. Everything Henry did to her, the cold houses and the reduced household and the cut income and the constant pressure and the unbearable separation from Mary, was designed to break her, and it did. She could have ended it all at any moment with a single signature, could have had warmth and comfort and honour, and perhaps even her daughter's company, simply by agreeing that her marriage had been no marriage, and she would not for one day, not for 1 hour, because to her it was not about comfort, but about truth and the salvation of her soul. And so the years of banishment, which were meant to be her defeat, became instead the fullest proof of who she was, a woman whom the mightiest king in Europe, with all the machinery of the state at his command, simply could not move. He could make her cold and poor and sick and lonely. He could keep her from her child. He could strip away her title and her household and her health. He could not make her lie. And in the end, that immovable refusal, maintained alone and unarmed across turning of suffering, was a kind of victory that nothing he did could match. Through the long years of her trouble, Catherine was not entirely without allies, and the most important of them was a sharp-eyed Spaniard named Eustace Chapuis, the ambassador of her nephew, the Emperor Charles, who arrived in England in the thick of the great matter and became her devoted champion and, for us across the centuries, our window into her ordeal. Chapuis was clever, loyal, and tireless, and he despised what was being done to Catherine. He visited her when he was allowed and schemed to see her when he was not. He carried her cause to the emperor and pressed it relentlessly, and he wrote voluminously, in long dispatches back to his master, recording everything he saw and heard at the English court. And it is largely through his eyes that we know the details of Catherine's last years, her words and her courage and her sufferings, for he set them all down in his letters, an ardent partisan but a careful observer. Anard. Through Chapuis, Catherine was drawn into a secret and dangerous game of diplomacy, even from her isolation. She and the ambassador corresponded in secret, smuggling letters past her watchers. There were schemes and proposals floated in these times that, had Catherine embraced them, might have lit a far larger fire. Chapuis and others believed that if Catherine and Mary would only call upon the emperor, the leading Catholic powers of Europe might intervene against the schismatic English king, by diplomacy or even by force. The common people loved Catherine. Much of the country hated the religious revolution, and a rising in her name, backed by imperial arms, was not an idle fantasy. The emperor had the power. Chapuis had the will. The pieces, in theory, were there for a rebellion or an invasion that might have toppled Henry and undone everything. And here we see something essential about Catherine, something that complicates the picture of the purely passive victim. She would not do it. Pressed to call for foreign intervention, to encourage rebellion, to set in motion the forces that might have saved her and her daughter and the old faith, she refused, again and again. She would not be the cause of war in England. She would not have English blood shed in her name, would not loose the horrors of invasion and rebellion on the country that had become her own and whose people loved her. She maintained, with the same iron consistency she brought to everything, that she was Henry's true and loyal wife and subject, and that she would not act against him or his realm, however grievously he wronged her. She would defend her marriage and her daughter's rights with every legal and spiritual weapon she possessed, to the last breath, but she would not take up the sword or call others to take it up on her behalf. Her resistance was absolute, but it was also entirely without violence, a refusal that harmed no one but herself. It is one of the most striking things about her, and it sets her apart from so many of the players in this brutal age. She had perhaps the means to fight back in the hardest way, to become the centre of an armed Catholic resistance to Henry's revolution, and the temptation must have been real, especially when she thought of her daughter's danger. But she chose not to. She chose to suffer rather than to make others suffer, to endure the destruction of her own life rather than to risk the lives of the English people in a war fought in her name. Whether this was pure saintly restraint or also a clear-eyed judgment that such a rising would likely fail and bring catastrophe, we cannot fully know, and it was probably both, for Catherine was both devout and shrewd. But the result was a kind of heroism that is easy to overlook, the heroism of the person who has the power to start a fire and chooses not to, who absorbs the injustice into herself, rather than spreading it outward into the world. She went down alone, defending only her own truth, and she took no one with her, and in an age soaked in blood that quiet refusal to shed any was its own form of greatness. It is worth pausing to understand how much of England was with her, silently and not so silently through all these years, because Catherine was never as alone as Henry wished her to be. The common people loved her, and they did not love Anne Boleyn, and they were not shy about it. Catherine had been their queen for 20 years, dignified and devout and generous, the wronged wife of the popular imagination, and the sight of her being cast aside for a younger woman offended the deep sense of justice of ordinary English men and women. When Catherine travelled between her houses, people came out to line the roads and call out their loyalty, to shout that she was the true queen, and no amount of royal displeasure could stop them. Women especially were said to be fierce in her defence. Her cause became, for many, bound up with loyalty to the old faith and the old certainties that Henry was tearing down, and the deeper Henry pushed the religious revolution, the more Catherine became a symbol of everything that was being lost. And it was not only Fisher who paid for that loyalty with his life. The break with Rome required Henry's subjects to swear oaths acknowledging his supremacy over the church, and the validity of his new marriage and the succession of Anne's children, and most people swore because they had families and lives and no wish to die. But some would not. Thomas More, the brilliant and saintly former Lord Chancellor, the King's old friend, refused to swear, and kept his silence about his reasons, and was executed for it just days after Fisher, going to the scaffold with the famous declaration that he died the King's good servant, but God's first. These deaths were bound up with Catherine's cause, men dying rather than accept the new order that her destruction had brought about, and she felt the weight of it, the knowledge that good men were going to their deaths in a struggle that had begun with her marriage. She had not asked for any of it. She had wanted nothing but to remain where God had placed her, but the consequences of her refusal rippled outward into the deaths of others, and she carried that knowledge with everything else in her season of exile. I want to come back to the people of England and their love for Catherine, because it was real and it was powerful, and it is among the most moving threads in her whole story, the bond between a foreign-born queen and the ordinary men and women of her adopted country. From the day she landed at Plymouth as a girl, the English had taken to her, and across her 20 years as queen that affection had only deepened, until by the time of her troubles she commanded a depth of popular love that Henry, for all his power, could not match and could not break. She had been their queen for 2 decades, dignified and devout and generous to the poor, and the sight of her being cast aside for a younger woman struck at the deep sense of fairness in ordinary people, who knew a wronged wife when they saw one. The expressions of that love grew bolder as her troubles deepened, and they alarmed the king and his ministers. When Catherine travelled between her houses of confinement, people came out to line the roads, to call her blessing, to shout that she was the true queen and always would be, no matter what any court or parliament said. The crowds were said to be especially fierce in her defence, the women most of all, who took the wronged queen's cause personally and were not afraid to say so. There were reports of demonstrations, of angry words against Anne Boleyn, of a current of popular feeling running so strongly in Catherine's favour that the authorities watched it nervously, for a beloved queen with the common people behind her was a dangerous thing for a king bent on discarding her. Her popularity was a kind of power, the one kind she retained when all the rest had been stripped away, and Henry could deny her the title and the household and the daughter, but he could not order the people to stop loving her. That love was bound up, too, with the wider loyalties of the age, with attachment to the old faith and the old ways that Henry was tearing down. For many ordinary English men and women, Catherine became the symbol of everything that was being lost, the true queen and the true church set against the upstart and the schism. To defend Catherine was, for many, to defend the old certainties against a frightening new order, and so her cause gathered to itself all the inchoate fear and resentment that the religious revolution provoked. The Northern Rebellion, the Pilgrimage of Grace, which rose in part against the dissolution of the monasteries and the break with Rome, drew on exactly this well of feeling, and though it came after Catherine's death, the loyalty that fed it was the same loyalty that had lined the roads to cheer her. She had become, without seeking it, the living emblem of the old England against the new, and that popular love outlasted her and outlasts her still. When she died and was buried at Peterborough, the people of the surrounding country came in their thousands to mourn her, far more than any royal command could have summoned, drawn by genuine grief for a queen they had loved. And across the centuries since, her grave has drawn a quiet, persistent stream of visitors who come to honour her, who leave flowers and pomegranates, the emblem she brought from Spain as a girl, upon the stone. There is something remarkable in that 500 winter after her death, people still come to lay tokens on the grave of Catherine of Aragon, still moved by the story of the wronged queen who would not be broken. The love that the English gave her in life, freely and against their king's wishes, has proved more durable than all the power that was used to destroy her. Henry is remembered as a monster and a tyrant. Catherine is remembered with affection and respect and a kind of tenderness, and the people who come to her grave with their flowers and their pomegranates are, in a sense, the descendants of the crowds who lined the roads to cheer her, keeping faith with a queen who kept faith with them. Through it all, Catherine's faith was not a comfort she reached for in extremity, but the very substance of who she was, the thing that made her unbreakable. She spent the long hours of her confinement in prayer and devotion, rising in the small hours to pray as she had been taught in her mother's court, wearing beneath her gown the rough habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, fasting, attending Mass, ordering her shrinking household around the rhythms of the Church. Her religion was not gentle or sentimental. It was the iron faith of the Spain that had taken Granada, absolute and certain and entirely without doubt, and it gave her a place to stand that no king could take away. Henry could strip her of her title and her daughter and her freedom and her comfort, but he could not touch the thing that mattered most to her, her conviction that she was right with God, that she was Henry's true wife in the eyes of heaven, and that her suffering borne patiently was itself a form of service to God. In a strange way, the years of banishment were the fullest expression of everything she had been raised to be. Stripped of every worldly thing, she became most purely herself, a woman of total faith and total will, and in that she found a freedom her jailers could never understand. The last act was played out at a place called Kimbleton, a damp and gloomy manor house in the flat country of the Eastern Fens, where Catherine was moved in 1534, and where she would spend her final months. It was a miserable place for a dying woman, cold and unhealthy, and her health worn down by years of grief and confinement, and the bad air of the fenland houses began to fail in earnest. She kept to a few rooms, attended by the handful of loyal Spanish servants who'd refused to leave her, eating little, praying much, growing weaker through the autumn and winter of 1535. She knew she was dying, and as the end approached, she asked for the one thing she wanted more than any other in the world, which was to see her daughter Mary one last time, to hold her child before she died. Henry refused. Even now, even with Catherine clearly dying, he would not permit the mother and daughter to meet, would not grant a dying woman that one mercy, because to do so might have looked like a softening, an admission. Mary was kept away. Catherine would die without seeing her daughter's face again, and the cruelty of that refusal is something that has never been forgiven and never should be. Let me bring you to Kimbolton in that last winter, gently, because it is where her long road ended, and the place itself was part of the cruelty. It was an old manor house in the flat fen country of Huntingdonshire, low and damp and gloomy, ringed by the wet flat fields and the grey skies of an English winter, about as far in every sense from the warm red courts of her Spanish childhood as a place could be. Catherine was moved there in 1534 and kept in a few rooms, attended by the small remnant of her household, the loyal Spaniards who would not leave her, her physician, her apothecary, a few women. She was nearing 50 now, but she was older than her turning, worn down by decades of grief and the bad fenland air and the long privations of her exile, and through the autumn and winter of 1535 it became clear that she was failing. She kept to her rooms, where the fires were never quite enough against the fen damp, and she spent her dwindling strength as she had spent her whole life, in prayer. She ate very little. She slept badly. She was often in pain, a gnawing trouble in her chest and her stomach that her physicians could not relieve and did not understand, that we now think was very likely a cancer, eating at her from within. And yet the accounts of these last months are not somehow accounts of despair. There is a strange peace in them, the peace of a woman who has fought her whole long fight, and has nothing left to do but commend herself to God. She had not surrendered. She had kept the faith. Whatever was coming, she would meet it as Catherine the Queen, and she knew it, and there was a kind of serenity in that knowledge that even her enemies could not take from her. There was one mercy at the very end, and it came against the rules, as the best mercies often do. For although Henry kept her daughter from her, he could not keep away everyone who loved her. So that Catherine, who had been denied her own child, was at least not entirely alone among strangers at the end, but had beside her faces she had known and loved, and one, above all, that reached back across the whole of her life to the girl who had set sail from Spain. I want to say something about the handful of people who stayed with Catherine to the end, the little few who would not abandon her, because their faithfulness is part of her story, and it tells us something about the woman who could inspire such devotion. When Catherine was stripped of her vast household and shut away in her cold houses, most of the grand court figures who had surrounded her in her years of glory melted away, as courtiers do, drawn to where the power and the favour now lay. But some would not go. A small band of servants, many of them the Spaniards who had come with her from her homeland long ago, refused to leave her, choosing exile and discomfort, and the king's displeasure over abandoning the mistress they loved. They served her in her reduced and watched and impoverished confinement, sharing her hardships, keeping her small household running, standing by her when standing by her brought no advantage and considerable risk. Chief among them was Maria de Salinas, the woman who had crossed the sea with Catherine as a girl decades before, and had been her friend and companion ever since. The two of them had grown up together in the warm certainty of Spain, and had come together to the cold uncertainty of England, and across all the long years and all the changes of fortune, Maria's loyalty never wavered. She had married an English nobleman and made her life in England, but her heart stayed with Catherine, and when she heard that her old friend was dying at Kimbolton, forbidden visitors and kept among strangers, Maria simply went, without permission, and forced and pleaded her way past the guards, and would not be turned away, and reached Catherine's side at the last. It was an act of pure love and pure defiance, and it meant that Catherine denied her own daughter, at least did not die entirely among the agents of the king, but with one beloved face beside her, a face that reached all the way back to the beginning of her life. There is something deeply telling in this, in the quality of the loyalty Catherine inspired. The powerful and the calculating abandoned her, because there was nothing to be gained by staying. But those who knew her best and loved her truly, the servants who had served her longest, the friend who had known her since girlhood, these would not leave her for anything, would risk the king's wrath and endure cold and poverty and danger rather than desert her. You can tell a good deal about a person by who stays when there is nothing left to gain by staying, and the people who stayed with Catherine to the end were the ones who had known her most intimately and longest, which is its own kind of testimony to the woman she was beneath the public dignity, a woman worth loving, worth following into hardship, worth defying a king for. And so she did not die alone, though Henry did everything to ensure she would die without the one person she most wanted. She died surrounded by the faithful remnant, the loyal servants, and the old friend, with the rites of her church and the prayers she had said all her life, in the company of love, even in that cold and gloomy house. It was not the death she would have chosen, far from her daughter, far from Spain, a prisoner in the fens of a country that had turned against her. But it was not a friendless death either, and the small band who stayed with her, who chose her over their own safety and advantage, gave her at the end the one comfort the king could not take away, the simple human comfort of being loved and attended by those who would not leave. Catherine the Queen, she signed her last letter, and the people around her deathbed knew her to be exactly that, whatever any king or court had decreed, and they stayed with their queen to the end. In those last days she gathered her failing strength for what mattered most. She made her confession and received the last rites of the church she had never for one moment abandoned. She thought of her servants, the faithful few, and worried about what would become of them when she was gone. She thought of her daughter and grieved that she could not see her, and she dictated the last letter to Henry, the one we spoke of at the very beginning of this evening, the letter with no bitterness in it, only love and forgiveness, and that final unbreakable signature. And then, on the 7th of January 1536, in the morning, with her old friend beside her and her prayers on her lips, the long life of Catherine of Aragon came quietly to its end in that gloomy fenland house, and the most formidable woman of the Tudor age, who had outlasted every attempt to break her, was at last at peace. And as her strength ebbed, in those first days of January 1536, Catherine gathered herself for one final act, the one we promised at the very beginning of this evening we would reach. She dictated a last letter to Henry, the husband who had spent nearly a decade trying to erase her, and the letter is among the most extraordinary documents to survive from that whole age because it contains no bitterness, no reproach, only love and forgiveness, and a final, unbreakable assertion of who she was. She addressed it to him as her most dear lord, king, and husband, the very titles he had spent time denying she had any right to use, and she used them not in defiance but in simple truth, because to her they were true. She wrote that the hour of her death now drawing near, the tender love she owed him, compelled her to commend to him the health of his soul, which he ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care of his own body, for the sake of which he had cast her into many calamities and himself into many troubles. She forgave him everything. She commended their daughter Mary to him, begging him to be a good father to her, as she had always desired. She asked him to be good to her servants, the handful who had stayed with her, and to see them provided for. And then she closed the letter, this woman whom he had tried for years to make into a nobody, with words that have outlived everyone who tried to silence her. She signed herself after all of it, after the banishment and the cold houses, and the stolen daughter and the denied title, with a phrase that asserted, gently and absolutely and forever, exactly who she was. Catherine the Queen. She died on the 7th of January, 1536, in the morning. Having received the last rites of the Church, she had never for one moment abandoned, her old friend beside her, her final prayers on her lips. She was 50 years old. She had been a princess of Spain, a queen of England, a wife, mother, a widow twice over, and at the very end, a prisoner in a cold house in a foreign land, and she had not, in all of it, across all those seasons, surrendered 1 inch of what she believed to be the truth. When the news reached the court, Henry and Anne, by some accounts, dressed in celebratory yellow, were relieved that the obstacle was gone at last. But that relief would prove a bitter miscalculation, for Catherine's death did not secure Anne. It freed Henry to be rid of Anne too, and within 5 months Anne Boleyn would herself be dead on the scaffold, and the wheel would keep on turning, as it always did around Henry VIII, grinding up wife after wife and servant after servant in the pursuit of the son and the certainty he could never quite grasp. There is a story, impossible to verify, and probably untrue but too haunting to leave out, that when Catherine's body was examined after death, her heart was found to be blackened, and that some whispered of poison. The truth is almost certainly that she died of a cancer of the heart, a natural disease, the worn-out ending of a body that had borne too much grief for too long. But the legend of the blackened heart endured, as legends do, because it seemed to express something true about a woman who had been so wronged. She was buried, by Henry's order, not as a queen but as a princess dowager, in Peterborough Abbey, with the lesser honours due to a prince's widow rather than a king's wife, a final pointed denial of the title she had defended with her life. Henry did not attend, but the people of the surrounding country came in their thousands to mourn her, and she was laid to rest in the Abbey Church at Peterborough, where she lies still, beneath a stone that for centuries bore no proper royal title, until much later ages, recognizing what she had been, began to honour her grave. Today there is almost always something laid upon it, flowers, pomegranates, the symbol of her own device that she had brought from Spain as a girl, left by visitors who come, across all these centuries, to pay their respects to a queen who would not be erased. That then was the daughter Catherine died without seeing, and the long vindication and the long tragedy that lay ahead of her. But Mary's story belonged to the years after, and for Catherine herself the road had reached its end in the cold house in the fens. So let us turn, before we let her rest, to the question we began with. We cannot leave Catherine's story without staying a while with the daughter at the centre of her heart, because Mary was both the abiding love of Catherine's life and the focus of her deepest fear, and what happened to Mary is inseparable from what happened to Catherine. Mary had been born in 1516, the one child to survive out of all those pregnancies, and Catherine had poured into her all the fierce and concentrated love of a mother who had buried so many. She had overseen Mary's education with the same care Isabella had given her own, raising a bright, accomplished, devout girl, a princess prepared, should it come to that, to rule. For the first decade of her life, Mary was the cherished heir, the king's pearl, treated as the future of the dynasty. And then her father's great matter destroyed her world as surely as it destroyed her mother's. When Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid, Mary was declared a bastard. At a stroke, she went from being the king's legitimate heir to being, in the eyes of the new order, the illegitimate daughter of a union that had never been a marriage. She was stripped of her title of princess. She was separated from her mother and forbidden to see her. The two of them kept deliberately apart to coerce them both. She was sent, in a final humiliation, to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the new heir, made to wait on the baby who had displaced her. She was bullied and threatened and pressed relentlessly to sign her acknowledgement that her parents' marriage had been unlawful and that she herself was illegitimate, a capitulation that would have broken her mother's heart and denied everything Catherine had suffered to defend. For years Mary held out, drawing courage from her mother's example and her mother's smuggled letters, those extraordinary letters in which Catherine, forbidden to see her child, urged her to obey the king in all things lawful, but to stand firm in matters of conscience whatever the cost, to trust in God, and to be, in the deepest sense, her mother's daughter. They were never allowed to meet again. Through all of Catherine's final illness, through the last months at Kimbolton, mother and daughter were kept apart, and Catherine's dying wish to see her child one last time was refused. The cruelty of that separation, sustained to the very end, is one of the hardest things in the whole story to forgive. Catherine died without seeing Mary's face, and Mary lost her mother while forbidden even to go to her, and the two of them, who had loved each other so fiercely, were denied the one comfort that might have eased the end. What became of Mary afterward is its own long tragedy, and it casts a complicated light back on her mother, unextended after Catherine's death. The isolated and frightened young woman, abandoned and in real danger, was at last broken into signing the submission she had so long resisted, acknowledging her own illegitimacy and her father's supremacy, a surrender wrung out of her under threat that she regretted with bitter anguish for the rest of her life. She survived the reign of her father and the brief reign of her young half-brother, and then, against every expectation, came to the throne in 1553 as Mary the first woman ever to rule England in her own right, the vindication of everything Catherine had believed her daughter could be. But the winter of suffering had left their mark, and Mary's short reign was a grim and bloody attempt to drag England back to her mother's faith by fire, burning those who would not return to Rome, earning a dark name that has clung to her ever since. It is a painful irony that the iron faith Catherine bequeathed to her daughter, which in the mother took the form of patient and harmless endurance, in the daughter curdled into persecution. But whatever we make of Mary the Queen, she was Catherine's child, raised by Catherine to believe a woman could rule, and rule she did. And in that, at least, the discarded queen who was supposed to have failed to produce an heir was vindicated at the last. Before we let the evening draw down towards sleep, I want to think for a moment about how Catherine has been remembered, because the shape of her reputation across 5 centuries tells us something about her and about us. For a long time she was overshadowed, as she is overshadowed even in the way we first meet her, by the louder and more sensational figures around her, by Henry the Colossus, and by Anne Boleyn with her dramatic rise and bloody fall. In the extended gallery of Henry's 6 wives, Catherine is too often reduced to the first panel, the discarded one, that dignified but rather dim figure at the start of a story that gets more exciting after she leaves it. That is a thin and unjust version of her, and it has taken a long time for the fuller woman to come back into focus. But she has come back, and the recovery of Catherine is one of the quiet satisfactions of how history corrects itself over time. Scholars and readers have rediscovered the extraordinary woman beneath the meek caricature, the learned princess, the capable regent who won a war, the shrewd diplomat, the woman of formidable will and intellect, who fought the most powerful king in Europe to a standstill on the strength of her conviction alone. They have rediscovered her courage, which was of a rare and unspectacular kind, not the courage of the battlefield or the grand gesture, but the harder courage of endurance, of holding to the truth year after turning under relentless pressure, alone, with everything to lose and nothing to gain but the integrity of her own soul. In an age that we sometimes imagine offered women no agency at all, Catherine exercised a moral power that brought a king and a kingdom up short, and did it without an army, without a throne, without anything but her own unbreakable refusal to lie. It is worth being honest about her flaws too, because they are part of what makes her real rather than a plaster saint. Her faith had an iron, unbending quality that left no room for doubt or compromise, the same absolute certainty that, inherited by her daughter Mary, would turn to cruelty and the burning of heretics. Her conviction that she was right was so total that she could contemplate, without flinching, the suffering that her refusal to yield brought upon her daughter and upon the men who died defending her cause, judging that the truth and the faith were worth any price, even prices paid by others. That certainty was the source of her greatness, and also its shadow, and we do her no honour by pretending she was simply gentle and good. She was formidable, and formidable people are rarely simple. But when everything is weighed, she stands as one of the most admirable figures of that brutal age, and certainly one of the bravest. She was honest in a court built on lies, loyal in a world of betrayal, steadfast where almost everyone else bent. She loved her daughter with a fierce devotion, and was denied her at the end. She loved a husband who turned on her and tried to erase her, and she met his cruelty not with hatred, but in that astonishing final letter with forgiveness. She had been raised by a powerful queen to be a queen herself, and when every outward mark of greatness was stripped from her, the inward greatness remained and could not be touched. Catherine the Queen, she signed herself with her dying hand, after all those years of being told she was no queen at all, and the simple defiance of those 3 words contains the whole of her. They could take everything else. They could not take that. And across 500 years, when the noise of the louder figures has died away, it is that quiet, unbreakable assertion of who she was that endures, and that we have come tonight, in our own small way, to honour. So we come at last to the question of what we are to make of her. This woman we began the evening half remembering as merely the first of 6, the one who was discarded. She was, I think, one of the most genuinely admirable people in the whole turbulent story of the Tudors, and one of the bravest. She was not perfect. Her faith had an iron and unbending quality that in her daughter would curdle into something cruel, and her absolute certainty left no room for doubt or compromise. But she was honest to the depths of her soul, and loyal and courageous beyond almost anyone of her age, a woman who faced down the most powerful and dangerous king in Europe with nothing but her conviction and her dignity, and who never, in all the time of pressure and isolation and grief, gave him the surrender he demanded. She had been raised by a mighty queen to be a queen in her own right, and when everything was stripped away from her, the title, and the husband, and the daughter, and the comfort, and the power, what remained was the thing they could not take, the unbreakable core of who she was. Catherine the Queen, she signed herself at the very end, and across 500 years that is exactly how we remember her. and now the candles are burning low, and her story has been told, all the way from the sunlit courts of Spain to the cold fens of England, and there is nothing left to do but let it settle, and let yourself begin to drift down towards sleep. Let the trials and the cold houses fade. Hold instead, if you want something gentle to carry down into the dark, the earliest picture, the small girl in her mother's restless court, with the banners rising over the Alhambra, and the whole of her remarkable life still ahead of her, and everything still possible. Let her be young again, in the warm Spanish sun, before any of the sorrow came. The past is gentle once it is finished. It cannot be changed, and it asks nothing of us except that we remember it kindly. And remembering kindly is a quiet and a peaceful thing, the kind of thing that loosens the shoulders and slows the breath and lets the whole long day finally go. If you have found something restful here tonight, in this slow walk through a life lived so long ago, then I am glad, and you might think about subscribing before you drift off, so that the next of these journeys finds its way to you when you need it. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever the hour is where you are, I hope the house is warm around you, and the bed is soft beneath you, and the morning, when it comes, is kind. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.